Far back in antiquity, long before the Roman legions reached the island, a Greek traveller named Pythias of Massalia is said to have explored the distant coasts of the north. He sailed from the Mediterranean city of Massalia, known today as Marseille, moving along the Atlantic shores until he reached the region around Cadiz in southern Spain. From there, he continued his voyage across the sea and arrived in southern Britain, where he spent some time observing the land and its people. The exact dates of his life are uncertain, though he clearly belonged to the era of Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BC at a young age. Because Pythias lived so early, his journey tells us little about the detailed character of Britain's inhabitants. The world he encountered lies deep in the shadows of prehistoric time, where written evidence is rare and certainty is difficult to achieve. Ancient writers themselves admitted how little was truly known about the first people of Britain. The Roman historian Tacitus explained that even careful inquiry could not determine whether the earliest inhabitants were native to the island, or had arrived long ago from foreign lands. Among peoples considered barbarian by the standards of the classical world, traditions were rarely recorded in writing. Knowledge was passed down through memory rather than preserved in documents, leaving later historians with only fragments of information. Some scholars of antiquity believe that the population of Britain may have originated from nearby Gaul, since the island lies so close to the continental coast. Julius Caesar, writing more than a century before Tacitus, offered another perspective based on his own campaigns. According to his account, the interior regions of Britain were occupied by the most ancient inhabitants of the island, people who were believed by tradition to be the original population. The coastal areas, however, were different. These shores had been settled by groups who crossed the sea from the lands of Gaul and Belgium in search of new territories. Many of these migrants continued to use the names of the communities from which they had originally come. Tribes such as the Belgae, the Atrebats, the Parisii, and the Cenomani were remembered as examples of this movement of people across the Channel. Another question raised by early writers concerns the maritime abilities of the inhabitants. Caesar described fleets of ships that operated along the coasts and suggested that the southern Britons possessed considerable skill in navigation. Later interpretations propose that these vessels may actually have belonged to seafaring tribes from Brittany, particularly a people known for their experience in ocean travel. These groups were accustomed to sailing frequently between the continent and Britain, giving them a clear advantage over inland populations that had little connection with the sea. Religion also connected Britain closely with the Celtic world of Gaul. Caesar noted that the teachings of the Druids were believed to have originated in Britain and later spread across the Channel. Students from Gaul who wished to master these traditions sometimes travelled to Britain for instruction. The Druids did not record their teachings in written form. Their knowledge was transmitted orally, preserved in memory and spoken in the languages shared among Celtic communities. Tacitus later confirmed that the religious practices of Britain closely resembled those found in Gaul, and that similar beliefs and rituals were common on both sides of the sea. Language and daily life revealed further similarities. Classical writers observed that the peoples of Gaul spoke slightly different dialects, rather than entirely separate languages. According to Tacitus, the speech of the Britons did not differ greatly from that of the Gauls. Their houses were described as being built in wooded areas and constructed in much the same way as those on the continent. Customs and appearance were also comparable. Both peoples often wore their hair long, and many aspects of their social behaviour seemed familiar to observers who had travelled through Gaul. In warfare, the Britons were known for using large numbers of chariots, a practice that had also appeared among certain Celtic groups in Europe. Later scholars examining place names in Wales noticed another intriguing detail. Some of the oldest geographical names appeared to belong to the Gaelic linguistic tradition, rather than the Welsh language. This observation suggested that earlier inhabitants, possibly related to Gaelic-speaking peoples, once occupied these regions before later arrivals pushed them toward the north and west. Over time, new populations gradually replaced or absorbed the earlier ones, creating a complex mixture of cultures throughout Britain and Ireland. The term used by the Welsh people for themselves offers another clue to these ancient identities. The word Cymru became the common name used to describe their own community and those who shared their heritage. Some scholars connected this name to the ancient peoples known in classical texts as the Cimbri or Cimmerians. Whatever its exact origin, the term emphasized the idea of a shared homeland and a common people. Over centuries, the descendants of these groups would form the cultural roots of the Welsh, the Cornish, and other Brittonic communities. As historians attempted to reconstruct the distant past, several broad groups began to emerge in their interpretations. One category referred to the mysterious early inhabitants, whose identity remains largely unknown. After them came Celtic populations, often associated with the Gaelic traditions. Later still, new Celtic groups connected with the Brythonic languages spread through many parts of Britain. These overlapping waves of settlement created a layered population whose origins stretch back into the prehistoric world. Some theories even suggested that the earliest inhabitants of Britain and Ireland may have spoken a language unrelated to Celtic. According to this idea, the language of those ancient peoples might have shared distant connections with the Basque language of the Western Pyrenees. Although such proposals remain uncertain, they highlight the complexity of the island's early history. The newcomers did not necessarily eliminate those who came before them. Instead, many groups merged together over time, blending languages and customs into new cultural forms. Classical writers also tried to explain the origin of the name Britain itself. One suggestion was that the inhabitants or their neighbours in Gaul gave the island its name, based on an older word meaning painted or coloured. Many ancient sources describe the Britons as decorating their bodies with pigments or dyes. Because of this custom, the name associated with painted people may gradually have become linked to the island they inhabited. Greek travellers appear to have adopted similar names for the region long before Roman influence reached its shores. By the time Rome became interested in Britain, the island already contained numerous tribes and communities. The Roman historian Tacitus later wrote about northern lands inhabited by powerful peoples beyond the frontier. His account described the Caledonians in the rugged northern regions, and the Britons in the southern territories closer to Roman influence. The campaigns of the Roman general Agricola expanded Roman knowledge of the island dramatically. Through both land and naval operations, Roman forces explored coastlines, established camps, and mapped regions previously unknown to the Mediterranean world. The Roman presence eventually produced a network of fortifications and defensive lines intended to control the frontier. These barriers stretched across northern Britain to separate Roman territory from the lands of independent tribes. Over time, the frontier shifted, expanded, and contracted depending on the strength of Roman power and the resistance of northern peoples. Even so, the Romans never fully subdued the entire island. In the centuries that followed, Roman writers recorded the names of many tribes scattered across Britain and Scotland. Among them were the Caledonians, the Vacomagi, and several other groups occupying various regions, from the highlands to the eastern coasts. Later accounts also mention the appearance of the Picts, who became one of the dominant peoples of northern Britain during the later Roman period. Some authors describe them as divided into multiple groups, inhabiting different parts of the northern landscape. Roman records from the 4th century reveal how turbulent the frontier had become. Raids by Picts, Scots, and other northern warriors repeatedly struck the Roman provinces. These attacks demonstrated that the peoples beyond the frontier remained powerful and independent despite centuries of Roman contact. The struggle between Rome and the northern tribes continued until the final withdrawal of Roman authority from Britain. By that time, the island had already been shaped by layers of migration, cultural exchange, and conflict stretching far back into prehistory. The earliest inhabitants remain largely unknown, yet their legacy survived through the peoples who followed them. Celtic settlers, later communities, and Roman influence all contributed to the complex mosaic that formed early Britain. The story of these ancient races is therefore not a single narrative but a long unfolding history, where different cultures met, merged, and transformed the island over many centuries. By the time later Roman writers began describing the north in broader terms, many of the tribal names recorded earlier by Ptolemy seem to have lost their old importance. Some communities may have been absorbed into larger political groupings, while others were likely reduced to subordinate status. This also helps explain the place, occupied by the Scoti and the Atacotti, both of whom appear as the story unfolds, not as ancient native powers rooted from the beginning in northern Britain, but as groups closely tied to Ireland. Their movements across the sea were part of a wider pattern of mobility and pressure that affected the whole western coast. Raiding, settlement, and shifting loyalties linked Ireland and Britain far more deeply than older historical narratives once admitted. The same pattern can be seen in the case of the Cruithne of Ireland. They were not an isolated people living in complete separation from Britain, but a force that repeatedly crossed to the opposite coast of northern Britain and took part in its struggles. Those sea routes were active for centuries, and the narrow channels between Ulster and the western shores of Scotland and Galloway never formed a true barrier. They were highways. Looking at events from that perspective, the western side of Britain was never sealed off from Ireland. It was part of a shared world of movement, conflict, and colonization. The mention of the Saxons in these early northern settings has also caused confusion. In later centuries, the name Saxon became attached to Germanic peoples active in eastern and southern Britain. But in the far north, at this early stage, the situation appears different. The roving sea peoples referred to in northern waters were more likely Scandinavian adventurers than the Saxons known from later English history. The very fact that these raiders were associated with distant northern islands strongly suggests this. In the 4th century, when such references begin to appear, the more plausible identification is with Norse seafarers who were already probing the northern seas long before their later fame in the Viking Age. The name Pict has also been misunderstood for generations. Modern scholarship has generally moved away from treating it as the name of a single distinct race in the strict sense. Instead, it is far more convincing to see it as a label applied to people known for marking their bodies. These markings could be tattoos, painted patterns, or stains made with dyes and plant substances. Roman observers had already noticed such practices in Britain, though they did not always use one fixed name for those who followed them. In time, however, the name meaning painted people became attached especially to populations living beyond the main zone of Roman control. South of the Forth and Clyde, Roman influence brought profound cultural change. Customs that once may have been widespread gradually declined, where Roman administration, military presence, and urban habits took root. Body painting and tattooing seem to have faded in those districts, or at least lost the prominence they once had. North of that line, however, the older custom appears to have survived much longer. There, it remained striking enough for outsiders to treat it as a defining feature. In that sense, the label Pict became more limited over time, attached mainly to the peoples of the north who continued to preserve habits that had disappeared elsewhere. A similar habit existed in Ireland, where certain groups also decorated their bodies in ways that must have reminded Roman observers of the peoples north of the British frontier. This helps explain why names carrying related meanings appear in different places around the Irish Sea world. It also warns against accepting medieval accounts too literally. Early writers often repeated old traditions without testing them, and later generations then treated those traditions as solid history. Once those claims are examined carefully, many of them become far less certain than they first appear. This is especially true in the case of Bede. His writings are valuable because so few early records survive, but they cannot be treated as unquestionable truth. He wrote centuries after many of the events he described, and he worked far from the regions he discussed. His claim that the Picts were a special people from distant Scythia does not survive serious scrutiny. The same caution applies to his statements about Galloway. He wrote that the people there were called Picts in his own time, and that may indeed reflect usage in the 8th century. But that does not mean the same name was used in the same way in the age of St. Ninian, when Roman authority still shaped the district and the local population was known under older tribal names. During Ninian's lifetime, the region was still bound to the Roman world. The old inhabitants were not described by Roman writers as Picts, but as the Novantae and the Selgovae. At that stage, any Irish settlement that later helped transform Galloway was probably still at an early phase. The later use of the word Pict in the district seems to belong to a different historical moment, one shaped by migration from Ireland after Roman power weakened. Bede lived roughly 300 years after Ninian and wrote from far away in Northumbria. His distance in both time and place matters greatly. It explains why his language sometimes reflects later realities, rather than the conditions of the 5th century. Other early authors are no less difficult to trust. Gildas, Nennius, and Bede often disagree with one another, and the contradictions between them are too serious to ignore. Later scholars who repeated their statements without careful examination only deepen the confusion. Some modern critics have been blunt on this point, arguing that the old accounts of inland Britain rest on little more than scattered classical remarks and second-hand coastal reports. In that view, several famous early narratives are less records of fact than mixtures of memory, guesswork, and literary inheritance. A similar reassessment has taken place in discussions of the Northern Picts. In some modern interpretations, these northern groups were not strangers to the Gaelic world at all, but closely connected to it. They are linked with the Cruthan and presented as inhabitants of the lands north of the Forth and Clyde, as well as certain neighbouring regions. In Old Welsh tradition, they appear under names that connect them with Goidelic peoples. Irish traditions also preserve memories of related populations in the north of Ireland, especially in Ulster, where they survived as a distinct community for a long time. These Irish groups were not considered foreign in language. On the contrary, they seem to have spoken the same broad speech as other peoples of Ireland, even if they preserved a separate identity. That connection between the Picts of northern Britain and the Cruthan of Ireland is important. But it still does not solve every problem. It seems likely that the populations north of the Forth and Clyde were broadly Celtic, yet their speech and customs may have varied from district to district because of long contact with older inhabitants and with Brythonic neighbours. Such differences, even when not as great as later writers imagined, could easily have puzzled outsiders. A traveller or missionary encountering unfamiliar dialects might think he had found a completely different people, when in fact he had only crossed from one regional form of speech into another. That possibility may help explain stories about Columba struggling to communicate with certain people he met. There is no need to imagine a wholly separate race hidden in the background. Speech differences alone can create deep confusion, especially in an age without standard language. Even in much later times, strong local dialects could bewilder visitors from neighbouring districts. Northern Britain in the 6th century must have contained many such variations. The old tendency to turn every difficulty of language into proof of racial separation has likely done more harm than good. Legend has also gathered around the Picts in ways that reveal how easily folklore attaches itself to vanished peoples. One old tale claimed that the Picts possessed a secret method of brewing ale from heather, and that the recipe died with the last of them. The story is colourful, but it belongs to legend rather than history. It appears far more likely that such traditions grew out of northern brewing practices associated with later Scandinavian settlers, who flavoured their drink with various herbs. Heather and similar plants found on moorland landscapes would easily have become part of that memory. The tale survived because it was picturesque, not because it preserved genuine evidence about the Picts. The Scotti present another problem. They do not appear clearly in the earliest Roman geographical descriptions of Britain and Ireland. Ptolemy does not place them in the maps in the way later historians might expect. Even writers who mention the Picts in the late 3rd century are silent about the Scots. Only around that period do scattered references begin to suggest the existence of groups known by that name. In Ireland, they seem to have been regarded as later arrivals in certain regions, yet they rose to importance quickly and became dominant where they settled. By the 4th century, Roman writers were certainly aware of them. At that stage, Scots are mentioned alongside Picts as raiders troubling Roman Britain. But this does not necessarily prove that they had already established permanent kingdoms across northern Britain. It may only show that Irish-based war bands were active there. That distinction matters. A people can be feared before it becomes rooted. Raiding and settlement are not the same thing, though one often prepares the way for the other. Ireland itself was long known under the name Hibernia, and its inhabitants were described accordingly in Latin sources. The use of the name Scotia for Ireland belongs to a later development. Early Christian writers from Ireland still spoke of Scots there, but older forms of the island's name remained in circulation for a long time. That alone shows how careful one must be with names. Labels shifted gradually, and terms that later became fixed were once far more fluid. Some modern interpretations insist that no Scot set foot in northern Britain before the 4th century. That claim is too absolute. It may be true that no one was yet recorded under that name, but that is not the same as saying no members of the population later called Scots were present. Gaelic-speaking peoples had long-standing connections across the sea between Ireland and Western Britain. Whether the Romans used the term Scot or not, movements of related groups almost certainly predated the first surviving references. The absence of a label in Roman texts cannot by itself erase the reality of contact and migration. The dynasty that later ruled Scotland traced its line to settlers from Ireland who established themselves in Argyll. From them, according to the common view, the country eventually took its name. Yet even that explanation is not beyond dispute. Alternative suggestions have been offered, including the possibility that the name developed through Norse influence and ideas connected with tribute-paying land. Whatever the final answer, the argument itself shows how uncertain the early history of Scotland's name remains. Modern historians have also disagreed sharply over the earliest population of Britain. Some present the Aboriginal inhabitants of Scotland as fundamentally Celtic and as the ancestors of later Gaelic and Brittonic peoples. Others argue that the earliest population was non-Celtic and only gradually absorbed by incoming Celtic groups. In that model, the Goidels arrived first and were themselves transformed by mixing with the older inhabitants. Much later, Brythonic-speaking peoples advanced and pushed the Goidels from some districts, just as the Goidels had once displaced earlier populations. These competing interpretations reveal how incomplete the evidence remains. It is difficult to accept any theory in its most extreme form. The idea that the Celtic-speaking people of Scotland in the Roman age were direct and unmixed descendants of the earliest inhabitants is too simple. Yet the opposite claim, that the old population vanished so completely as to leave no trace, is equally hard to believe. More likely, ancient Britain saw repeated waves of blending, displacement, and adaptation. Peoples were not always exterminated, they were often absorbed. In such a setting, purity of race becomes more a later fantasy than an ancient reality. Another point often overlooked is the Roman contribution to this mixture. Roman soldiers did not all come from Italy. Many units were recruited from across the empire. Germans, Thracians, Spaniards, and others served in Britain, including in the north. Their presence meant that Rome introduced new human elements as well as military power. These soldiers did not always leave cleanly behind them. Relationships with local women must have been common, and children of mixed descent would have remained in the country. This human legacy is easy to ignore because it was seldom recorded, yet it must have mattered. Turning back to Galloway, the old tribes of the district were the Novantai and the Selgovai. These names survive in Roman records, but their true ethnic identity remains debated. One interpretation treats the Novantai as an ancient people who had held the region from very early times, perhaps even representing the older pre-Celtic population. The Selgovai, meanwhile, have been linked to a hunting people, their name possibly reflecting that way of life. Some have argued that the Solway itself preserves a memory of the Selgovai. Others have gone further and imagined these tribes as remnants of a very ancient, non-Celtic population that somehow endured longer than most. That interpretation is difficult to accept. Another theory proposed that the Novantai and Selgovai later formed the basis of the Atacotti, a people who caused major trouble to Roman Britain before being broken by imperial force. According to this view, they retained their distinctiveness, while neighbouring tribes became Brythonic in language and culture. Yet such a picture strains belief. Galloway was not an isolated island of survival sealed off from surrounding change. It lay exposed to movement from every side, bordered by sea routes and neighbouring peoples. There is no obvious reason why these tribes alone should have resisted the same pressures that transformed the rest of lowland Britain. A more convincing explanation is that later Gaelic speech in Galloway did not come from the old Roman age tribes themselves. Instead, it was brought in by settlers from Ireland after the Roman withdrawal, beginning around the end of imperial rule and continuing for generations. These newcomers gradually became dominant over the earlier population. In that case, the people later called Picts in Galloway would not have been identical with the Novantai and Selgovai known to the Romans. They would have been later arrivals whose settlement reshaped the district. This distinction matters when discussing place names and language. Some scholars tried to use place name evidence to deny a significant Brythonic presence in Galloway, but local geography does not support that conclusion. Cymric elements appear in the names of places across the district. Certain words long dismissed as Gaelic or explained away as corruptions can be understood more naturally through Brythonic usage. Errors by later mapmakers and antiquarians only added to the confusion, especially when place names were copied imperfectly or interpreted through the wrong linguistic lens. Once that happens, a whole district can be misread. The name of the Novantae has also been tied to the word for new, and through that connection some tried to associate them with the river Neath. But this too is doubtful, since the Novantae did not occupy the Nith Valley. Their eastern boundary lay much farther west. If the name did indeed involve an idea of newness, it is more plausible that it referred to a people or district designated by later newcomers, rather than to some immemorial Aboriginal identity. In that case, the name itself would point to change, not permanence. The older and more likely picture is that the Novantae were connected with the Cymric world and either displaced an earlier Goidelic-speaking population or replaced older inhabitants who had already been altered by previous contacts. The Selgovae, settled farther east and north, formed another neighbouring group, perhaps giving their name to the Solway region. Neither people was called Pict in the Roman age. That point is crucial. The label only gained force in Galloway later, after the conditions of the Roman frontier had disappeared. St. Ninian's mission is often drawn into this debate. Later, writers describe him as preaching to the Picts of Galloway. Yet that wording reflects a later age looking back, not the language of his own time. During his life, the district remained within the Roman world, and its inhabitants belonged to communities known by older names. Traditions identifying Ninian as a man from the Brythonic world fit that setting far better. The confusion arises because later, historians use the names familiar in their own centuries, when describing a past that had used different ones. After the Romans left, the Novantae and Selgovae vanish from the record under those names. They may have been absorbed by incoming groups from Ireland, displaced into neighbouring regions, or merged gradually into the wider population that emerged in the post-Roman centuries. Some may have moved east or south during the upheavals that followed imperial collapse. Others may have remained and simply lost their separate identity under new political masters. The silence of the sources prevents certainty, but the disappearance of the names does not mean the people themselves ceased to exist overnight. During the Roman age, the reach of imperial control spread across much of the land associated with the Brigantes, one of the largest peoples in ancient Britain. Their northern sphere seems to have stretched at least as far as the Solway in the west, and perhaps much closer to the Firth of Forth in the east than later writers once believed. Some historians have imagined an enormous Brigantian zone running from the Humber almost to the central belt of Scotland, with lesser tribes existing beneath its influence. Yet the neat frontier lines sometimes drawn on maps should be treated with caution. It is too easy to force the tribal world of ancient Britain into shapes that look convenient to modern eyes. A straight dividing line across northern Britain may look impressive on paper, but early tribal boundaries were rarely that precise. That is especially important when discussing the claim that the Roman frontier itself somehow created or explained these divisions. Ptolemy's geographical work belongs to the early 2nd century, and the dating does not fit comfortably with the argument that his northern boundary line was simply copied from the wall later associated with Hadrian. The chronology is too close, and in some respects too early, for that explanation to be entirely satisfying. This matters because later writers built wider arguments on that assumption, including the idea that Galloway at some stage belonged to a region called Brigantia. That view became influential enough to be repeated, but the evidence behind it is far from secure. Older scholars had already raised doubts about placing Brigantian territory so far north. The strongest tradition located the Brigantes firmly in what is now northern England, especially across the broad zone that included Yorkshire and the neighbouring districts, stretching westward toward Cumberland. Other descriptions also place them in the rougher wooded lands between the Humber and the Solway, which still keeps them south of Galloway itself. Their rise as a major power in Britain is clear enough, and Rome certainly fought a long struggle against them in the 1st century. But that does not automatically justify moving them into every northern district where later confusion appears. This is where the case of the Selgovae becomes important. Some have suggested that they were a Brigantian branch, or part of a larger Brigantian world extending into southern Scotland. Yet if that had truly been the case, the Roman writers who named them separately might have been expected to say so more clearly. Instead, the Selgovae appear under their own tribal name, just as other peoples beyond the main Brigantian zone do. That alone does not settle the matter, but it does weaken the idea that they were simply a northern extension of the Brigantes. Much of the argument rests on reconstruction rather than direct proof. The same problem appears in attempts to use later classical references to support a Brigantian presence far to the north. One often cited passage about military action under Antoninus Pius has been stretched in several directions. In one reading, the Brigantes were punished for raiding a people under Roman protection. In another, the victims were placed in a region identified with North Wales, rather than southern Scotland. The text itself is too vague to support the heavy burden placed on it. Once translated and interpreted differently, it can point in more than one direction. That makes it unsafe as a foundation for large conclusions about Galloway or the far north. Because of that uncertainty, later efforts to connect these references with peoples in Scotland become even more fragile. Some try to identify the mysterious names in those old passages with remote northern groups, then linked them to still later communities known from early medieval sources. That kind of chain can look clever, but every step depends on another assumption. Once one link fails, the entire structure becomes unstable. It is a reminder that resemblance in names does not always reveal identity. Ancient geography is full of echoes that tempt historians into false certainty. The story of Columba has often been brought into this discussion as further evidence of deep ethnic divisions in northern Britain. According to later tradition, when he moved among certain communities, he sometimes needed an interpreter, though not always. That detail has been made to carry more weight than it can safely bear. Dialect differences alone could create difficulty. A trained churchman speaking one form of Gaelic might easily be understood in one district, but not in another. That does not require the existence of a wholly separate race speaking a completely unrelated tongue. Language in the early medieval world was far less uniform than later scholars sometimes assumed. There is also the problem of distance and misplaced geography. Scenes from the life of Columba that belong to the far north or the Hebridean world have sometimes been pulled southward and fitted into arguments about Galloway. That is not convincing. A place in the Isle of Skye or near the River Ness cannot simply be made into evidence for the ethnic condition of southwestern Scotland. The regions are too far apart and the contexts are too different. Once such episodes are removed from their original setting, they can be made to support almost anything. An example of how far this method can drift appears in attempts to connect obscure names from one source with the supposed ancestors of later populations in Galloway. The result is a historical picture in which the Novantai and the Selgovae vanish behind names that properly belong elsewhere, while entirely different peoples are inserted into their territory. That approach is difficult to accept. In Roman times, Galloway was already known as the land of the Novantai in the west, and the Selgovae in the east. Those names are not inventions. They belong to the recorded geography of the province and cannot be dismissed merely because later theories prefer a different arrangement. A curious Roman episode shows how dangerous it can be to build too much on scattered anecdotes. During Agricola's northern campaigns, a cohort recruited in Germany is said to have mutinied, killed its officers, seized ships, and attempted an escape by sea. Their story became confused even in the ancient accounts. They drifted, fought local peoples, suffered hunger, and eventually disappeared into a chain of capture and resale far from where they began. It is a remarkable tale, but it proves how unstable frontier history could be. If one wished, it would be easy to invent entire hidden populations from such fragments. Yet speculation is not evidence. The story matters only because it shows how many strangers moved through Britain, and how easy it is for later historians to misread these traces. That brings the Atacotti into clearer focus. Few names in the history of late Roman Britain have generated more speculation, even though the broader outline is not especially mysterious. Irish tradition preserves the memory of a people who fit the name well enough. They appear as a subordinate population in Ireland, treated as inferior by dominant ruling groups and associated with older stocks, pushed aside by later powers. In that context, the name Atacotti belongs naturally to Ireland, not to Galloway. Their background lies across the sea in the social and political tensions of Hibernia, rather than in the native tribal structure of southwestern Scotland. These Irish traditions describe them as descendants of older peoples who survived beneath the rule of more powerful dynasties. They were not imagined as kings or aristocrats, but as subject communities, sometimes rebellious and sometimes dangerous. At one stage, they were said to have risen violently against the ruling order, killing leading figures and briefly lifting one of their own into power. Whether every detail is exact is less important than the general impression. The Atacotti emerge as a real and remembered social force in Ireland, one with every reason to appear in warbands, migrations, and mercenary service abroad. That background makes sense of their later appearance in Roman sources. By the 4th century, the Atacotti are associated with military unrest and frontier war. They appear alongside Picts and Irish raiders during the great disturbances that shook Roman Britain. Yet even here, it is important not to mistake raiding for settlement. A group can become visible in imperial records because it fought, plundered, or served as mercenaries, not because it held permanent territory in Britain. The Atacotti seem to fit that pattern. They appear suddenly, act violently, and are later found serving in the Roman military machine itself. Roman policy often turned enemies into soldiers. Men who had fought against the empire could be recruited, enrolled, and shipped elsewhere to serve under Roman command. That is exactly the sort of context in which the Atacotti become visible. There is evidence that bodies of them ended up in imperial service on the continent, just as other so-called barbarian groups did. Late Roman armies were full of such men. Frontier rebels could become imperial auxiliaries, with remarkable speed. Once this is understood, much of the mystery fades. The Atacotti do not need to be imagined as an ancient hidden nation of Galloway. They make far better sense as mobile fighters from Ireland, drawn into the violent politics of the 4th century. The wider rising in Britain during the later 4th century also supports that interpretation. The troubles that spread from the north deep into Roman territory involved multiple groups acting at once. Picts, Irish raiders, and others broke through the frontier while Roman control faltered badly. The empire recovered only after a determined campaign restored order and rebuilt the line between the Forth and Clyde. In such a crisis, there was every opportunity for transient warbands from across the sea to play a role. That does not mean they founded stable communities wherever they appeared. It only means the frontier was porous and dangerous. Contemporary writers from the late 4th century add a little more detail, though not always of the best kind. One church father repeated a lurid tale about the Atacotti and cannibalism, but there is no good reason to trust it. It reads more like a story repeated at a distance than a sober report. Such material belongs to the old habit of turning frontier peoples into monsters. Roman and late antique writers did this often. When stripped of exaggeration, the more reliable core remains that the Atacotti were known in the 4th century and were active in connection with Roman military affairs. That is enough. The darker embellishments are best left aside. The attempt to place the Atacotti in Galloway creates more problems than it solves. If they had truly been the settled inhabitants of that district during the Roman period, then the Roman writers would not have described the land as belonging to the Novantai and the Selgovae. Those names would have vanished earlier. The political and military logic also works against the theory. A displaced Irish prince who found refuge with Roman forces in Britain would hardly have chosen a district inhabited by the very kind of subject people who had been enemies to his line in Ireland. That detail alone makes the Galloway hypothesis highly doubtful. The more likely conclusion is that the Atacotti were not permanent settlers in Scotland at all, at least not in the period when they first entered the historical record. They seem rather to have been mercenary or raiding groups from Ireland, drawn into the wars of the late Empire and operating where opportunity allowed. Their sphere was mobility, not rooted occupation. Maps placing them in one Scottish region or another may reflect guesswork more than fact. Different writers scattered them across the north because their true position was uncertain. That very uncertainty warns against attaching them too firmly to Galloway. The history of Galloway becomes much easier to follow once that confusion is removed. The district did not begin as the land of the Atacotti. It was Roman Galloway, inhabited by the Novantai and the Selgovae, and shaped for centuries by imperial rule. Only after Rome weakened did a new phase begin, when settlers from Ireland entered in greater numbers and gradually changed the balance of power. In that later setting, names and identities shifted. Populations merged. Old tribal names faded, and the language of the district changed under new influence. This later movement from Ireland was real and substantial. It likely began well before the Viking Age and probably continued for generations. The Western Sea was never a barrier. Ulster and southwestern Scotland stood in constant contact, and the troubles within Ulster itself offer a strong explanation for migration. Political pressure, dynastic conflict, and competition for land could all drive groups across the narrow waters. Once established in Galloway, these settlers did not merely visit. They colonised, intermarried, and eventually became dominant over much of the older population. The history of Ulster helps explain why this happened. Ancient tradition speaks of a long line of rulers there, centred eventually on royal sites, that held both political and symbolic power. These dynasties were deeply conscious of ancestry and legitimacy. Their stories, like many early Irish traditions, reach back into a distant, heroic past where memory and legend are interwoven. The exact dates and genealogies are impossible to prove in detail, yet the broad political reality is clear enough. Ulster preserved a powerful regional identity, and the struggle for control of that province shaped much of Northern Irish history. Within that northern kingdom, one of the most important developments was the relationship between older local stocks and incoming ruling groups. The traditions describe a layered society in which one people did not simply replace another overnight. Older populations remained present, though often under pressure while new dynasties rose over them. At times, royal succession itself seems to have reflected this tension, with power moving between lines that represented different elements within Ulster society. That kind of arrangement makes far more historical sense than stories of total extermination or clean, ethnic replacement. In this setting, migration to Western Scotland no longer looks accidental. It appears instead as part of a long and natural process, linking Ulster and Galloway. The Irish Sea connected these lands culturally as much as geographically. Families, warbands, churchmen, and settlers could all cross it. Some came as raiders, others as exiles, others as colonists. Over time, they reshaped the district so deeply that later, writers looking backward often mistook these newer communities for the original inhabitants. That confusion lies at the heart of the problem. The people later remembered in Galloway under names associated with Picts or Irish settlers were not necessarily the same as the Roman age Novantai and Selgovai. The old tribes did not simply vanish in a single disaster, but neither did they remain unchanged. They were absorbed, overshadowed, or linguistically transformed as new arrivals gained ground. In the end, Galloway became one of those border regions where several layers of history survived at once. Roman memory, native tribal ancestry, Irish settlement, and later reinterpretation by medieval writers who no longer understood how the pieces once fitted together. The shifting politics of ancient Ulster became even more complicated as rival dynasties, tribal memory, and later storytelling blended into one long and often confusing tradition. Some later accounts describe Fiacha Finn as leading a large settlement of the Heremonian line into Ulster, where his followers overcame earlier rulers and seized a major share of the land. That broad picture reflects a struggle for control, but the deeper reality was more layered than a simple conquest. The Dal Fiatach, the Heremonian line, and the old Irian stock were not identical branches of one smooth national story. They belonged to different strands of early Irish tradition, and over time their histories were intertwined, merged, and reinterpreted by later writers who wanted to create a cleaner ancestry than the evidence truly allows. This is one reason the name of the Scots in Ireland must be handled carefully. Later tradition tried to push that identity back into a very remote past, linking it to heroic settlers from Spain and turning Ireland itself into the ancient land of the Scots from the earliest age. But that picture does not fit the older record well. The older name of the island was far more deeply rooted, and the title Scot appears in surviving writing much later than the legendary migrations to which it was attached. The effort to project the name backward belongs more to historical imagination and political pride than to firm chronology. It reflects a desire to give Ireland a grand and unified origin, even though the island was shaped by many peoples and many layers of settlement. The royal genealogies of Ulster preserve that same mixture of memory and uncertainty. Fiacha Finn was later said to have become a high king of Ireland and to have ruled for years before meeting a violent death. Tradition also placed his family within a wider network connecting Ireland and Britain. His wife was described as a daughter of a king from Alba, and after her husband's death she was said to have crossed the sea and given birth there to a son who would later return to Ireland and claim power. That son was Tuathul Techtmar, remembered as a forceful ruler who fought across Ulster, Leinster, Connaught, and Munster. Stories like this show how deeply Ireland and Britain were linked in political memory. Kingship was rarely presented as confined within one island. Lineage, exile, marriage, and war constantly crossed the sea. Other traditions push the same network even further back, tying later rulers to earlier heroic ancestors and giving noble marriages a northern setting. In those stories, royal women from the land later called Scotland appear repeatedly as wives or mothers in Irish dynastic lines. Whether every detail can be trusted is another matter, but the pattern itself is important. Ulster's ruling families did not imagine themselves as living in isolation. Their world stretched across the water, and that matters greatly when trying to explain later migration from Ulster into western Scotland and Galloway. By the 4th century, Ulster entered a particularly turbulent phase. A conflict between the King of Ulster and the High Kingship of Ireland triggered a struggle that changed the balance of power in the north. According to tradition, powerful figures recalled exiled kinsmen from Alba and brought them back with armed followers to intervene in Irish affairs. These returning war leaders are remembered as the Three Collars, and their campaign against the King of Ulster became one of the turning points in the province's history. Their victory shattered the older order, killed leading members of the ruling house, and opened the way for the dismemberment of the ancient kingdom. That process did not destroy Ulster in a single blow, but it began a long contraction. The old ruling lines were pushed eastward, while new power blocks carved out territory for themselves and laid the foundations of later dominance. The regal centre that had symbolised the older kingdom was broken, and the province that had once stretched wide was gradually reduced. What had once been a large and powerful Ulster was forced into a narrower corner, where its surviving rulers held on as best they could. This was not a brief moment of defeat followed by recovery. It was the start of a centuries-long struggle in which old families, new dynasties, and rival tribal confederacies competed for control. Within this shrinking eastern Ulster, two main elements remained especially important. One was the old Rúdarage stock, associated in later tradition with the ancient Cruithne. The other was the Dal Fiatach, who rose steadily in influence and eventually dominated much of the reduced kingdom. These two strands were not always in harmony, but over time they became so closely linked in the political life of Ulster that later memory often treated them almost as one. Kingship alternated between them, and together they preserved the identity of the Eastern Kingdom after the collapse of the wider Ulster realm. As Western Ulster was lost, the remaining territory was divided into two important zones. One was Dalriada, stretching across the northern reaches and facing the narrow sea route to Argyll. The other was Dalaradia, occupying the southern portion and extending through parts of Antrim and Down. These names are usually explained as territorial divisions associated with older ruling figures. But what matters more is what they reveal about the political geography of survival. The people driven into this reduced Eastern Kingdom did not vanish. They regrouped, retained their identity, and continued to rule in a diminished but still significant domain. In Dalaradia, the older Cruithne tradition remained especially strong. These people were remembered as ancient inhabitants of Ulster, and later writers attached many different origin stories to them. Some made them descendants of ancient conquerors. Others linked them to much older mythical populations. Still others folded them into broader narratives about migrations from distant lands. Such claims are impossible to confirm in detail, but they show that the Cruithne of Ulster were considered an old and distinct element within the population. Their identity mattered enough that later historians tried repeatedly to explain it, even when their explanations drifted into legend. The Dal Fiatach, by contrast, were more clearly tied in tradition to the Scots of Ireland. They occupied part of the same reduced eastern territory and became the dominant political family there over time. Although originally distinct from the older Cruithne line, they grew so closely bound to it that both groups came to be included under older labels that had once applied more narrowly. This blurring of identities is one of the most important features of Ulster history. separate tribal roots did not remain neatly divided forever. Under pressure, peoples merged politically, intermarried, shared kingship, and eventually carried composite identities into new regions. That pressure was severe. The reduced kingdom in eastern Ulster could not comfortably absorb all who had been forced into it. Even if many stayed behind in their old territories or were scattered elsewhere, the compression of so many connected peoples into Antrim, Down, and adjoining districts must have created intense strain. Land, rank, and opportunity were limited. A surplus population was inevitable. Once that is understood, outward movement becomes not only possible, but almost unavoidable. One medieval Irish observer captured that pressure vividly by describing the old kings of Ulster as hemmed into a narrow corner and nearly extinguished, with only those who left their ancestral territory surviving in any strength. That description belongs to a much later age, but it preserves a truth about the long-term condition of the province. Ulster's old ruling stock did not simply disappear. Some remained under pressure. Some adapted. Some declined. And some moved. For the people of northern Antrim, the route to Argyll was obvious, the sea crossing was short, the coast was visible, and kindred settlers were already present on the opposite shore. This made the movement into western Scotland both practical and attractive. Tradition preserves the well-known settlement in Argyll under Fergus More, and from that colony, later, Scottish kings claimed descent. Whether every detail of that foundation story is exact matters less than the larger reality. There was a real transfer of people from Ulster into Argyll, and it became one of the decisive events in the making of medieval Scotland. But the northern crossing to Argyll was not the only one. The southern stretch of Dalaradia faced Galloway across another narrow sea route. That crossing was slightly longer, but still easy enough in good conditions, and the coasts remained within sight. The same logic that sent settlers to Argyll could send others to Galloway. The movement need not have been one dramatic invasion. In fact, it is far more convincing as a gradual migration extending over generations. Families, warbands, churchmen, retainers, and displaced communities could all pass across in stages, until the Irish element in Galloway became numerous enough to dominate the region. That explains why the colonization of Galloway leaves such a different impression from the better-known settlement in Argyll. The northern movement was tied to a ruling line and preserved in royal memory. The southern movement was slower, less centralized, and spread across a longer period. For that very reason, it left fewer clear notices in formal chronicles. Yet the absence of dramatic announcement is not proof that it did not happen. On the contrary, the linguistic and cultural character of later Galloway points strongly toward exactly this kind of prolonged settlement from Ulster. Some traditions place a decisive moment in the 9th century, suggesting that Irish settlers in Galloway became fully dominant by force, perhaps by eliminating leading local figures after they had already established a strong presence. Even if that report is coloured by later storytelling, it fits the broader pattern. Colonization rarely begins with a single event. It builds over time until a point of political supremacy is reached. By the time a dramatic seizure of power is remembered, the migrants are usually no longer newcomers. They are already rooted, numerous, and confident enough to impose themselves. This also fits what happened farther east and north in the old Strathclyde world. The weakening of Brythonic control, the pressure of neighbouring powers, and the movement of peoples around the Irish Sea all created opportunities for the Irish element in Galloway to grow stronger. Over time, that district ceased to be simply the western edge of a Brythonic world and became something more mixed, more Gaelic, and more deeply tied to Ulster than earlier centuries had been. The connection between the settlers of Argyll and those of Galloway is especially important. They were not unrelated migrations from different worlds. They were branches of the same wider Ulster background. The Scots established in Argyll and the Irish settlers who transformed Galloway belonged to kindred stock, and for a long time the ties between them remained active. The kings of Ulster continued to exercise influence over these sea-linked communities, and tribute could still be demanded across the water. That detail is crucial because it shows that these settlements were not isolated accidents. They remained part of a living political network. One powerful ruler of Ulster stands out in this regard. His career was remembered with unusual detail, and his authority seems to have extended widely. A king of Dalriada in Argyll is said to have submitted to him and even joined him on expedition. Such a story reveals that the sea routes between Ulster and western Scotland were still operating as channels of overlordship, not merely migration. Another memory associated with this ruler tells of campaigns in the region later identified with Manu, suggesting that these northern and western zones were still contested spaces where Gaelic, Brittonic, and other elements met and clashed. The martial reputation of this Ulster line continued into the next generation. Battles across Ireland and victories over rival peoples are repeatedly attached to its rulers, and hostages from both Ireland and Alba are said to have been taken. Whether every triumph occurred exactly as later recounted is impossible to prove, but the pattern shows a dynasty still thinking and acting beyond the narrow borders of reduced eastern Ulster. Even after contraction, this was not a powerless remnant. It remained a force with ambitions that extended across the sea. At the same time, old distinctions between the Cruithan and the Irish Scots were gradually fading. Later, writers often failed to keep them apart. The older Rudrage element, the Dal Fiatash, the Cruithan of Ulster, and the settlers in Britain were often treated as if they belonged to one continuous and easily defined race. That oversimplifies the situation. These groups had different origins in tradition, different political roles, and different historical experiences. Yet through alliance, intermarriage, and shared pressure, they became intertwined so deeply that later, chroniclers often collapse them into one. This becomes especially clear in the story of Congal Clain. He was remembered as the last direct male ruler of the old Irian line in Ulidia, and his conflict with the High Kingship of Ireland became one of the great crises of the 7th century. After support promised to him was not delivered, he turned from frustrated ally into open rival. Defeated at first and driven into exile, he spent years gathering support. When he returned, he did not come alone. He crossed back with a composite force drawn from many lands around the Irish Sea. The description of that army is revealing. It included men identified as Picts, Britons, Saxons, and warriors from Alba. At first glance, the list seems straightforward, but it is anything but simple. The Picts may well reflect kindred groups from Galloway or related stocks, whose older identity still survived in memory. The Britons can be understood as remnants of the Brythonic populations still present in districts linked to Strathclyde. The Saxons are far less certain. In many early narratives, that label was used too freely and often seems to have been applied to northern seafarers or other outsiders who were not Saxons in the later English sense. The army of Congal was therefore not a tidy ethnic coalition. It was a practical war force gathered from the mixed frontier world of Western Britain and the Irish Sea. Its return to Ireland led to one of the most famous battles in early Irish tradition. The struggle was immense, involving major dynasties and a broad alliance of provincial power. Congal was defeated and killed, along with many of his supporters, both local and foreign. The defeat ended his hopes of restoring the old Ulster order in full. Yet the story matters for another reason. It proves how deeply connected Galloway, Alba, Ulster, and the Brittonic West still were. Men could be gathered from across all these regions for a single campaign. That alone says much about the movement of peoples and identities in the early medieval North. Ulster did not become peaceful after that. Internal conflict continued for centuries. Battles between the Ulidians and the Dal Araide, along with repeated struggles among rival lines, show that the province never fully escaped the divisions created by its earlier contraction. The old kingdom survived, but in a crippled and broken form. Each defeat weakened it further, while stronger rising dynasties took advantage. By the end of the 11th century, the old royal structure had been shattered beyond repair. The symbolic tree under which kings had once been inaugurated was cut down, and with that act the old order was publicly humiliated, as well as politically overthrown. Even then, the kingdom lingered on in diminished form, but only as a fragment of what it had once been. By that stage, the great northern dynasties had outgrown it, and Ulster's internal divisions made it vulnerable to every pressure around it. The long story of contraction, exile, and resettlement had done its work. Some of the descendants of those older Ulster peoples remained. Others had long since moved into Galloway, Argyll, and neighbouring districts, where they helped shape new societies. That is why the colonisation of Galloway by the Irish Scots should be treated as historical reality rather than legend. The peoples of eastern Ulster had both motive and opportunity to migrate. They were pressed into a restricted territory, divided among competing lines, and connected by constant sea routes to western Britain. The settlement of Galloway fits this world perfectly. It does not require fantasy or sudden invention. It follows naturally from the political pressure inside Ulster and the geography of the Irish Sea. The larger lesson is that early Ireland was never a land of one pure and unbroken nation. It contained many races, many ruling lines, and many layers of conquest and absorption. Over time, these peoples drew closer in language, customs, and outlook, but they did not begin as one. The same is true of Alba and Galloway. The Gaelic speech later found on both sides of the water did not prove a single simple origin. It was the result of movement, dominance, and blending across centuries. The Norse presence later added yet another layer to this already mixed world. Scandinavian power along Irish and Scottish coasts was strong from an early date and became especially important from the 8th century onward. Norse blood entered the population just as Norse influence entered trade, warfare, and kingship. Their settlements were not passing accidents. They held key ports, issued coinage, and shaped the politics of the region for generations. Even after famous defeats, they were not simply swept away. They remained woven into the society they had entered. All of this makes clear that Galloway cannot be understood in isolation. Its early history was tied to Ulster, to Argyll, to Strathclyde, and to the wider sea world linking Britain and Ireland. The Irish Scots who crossed into the district were not strangers from some unrelated land. They were part of a long-moving frontier population, connected by blood, speech, warfare, and tradition to communities on both sides of the water. Their arrival in Galloway was not a myth born of late imagination. It was one of the central events that transformed the region after Rome. The closeness of the crossing helps explain why. From Down to Galloway, the distance was short enough for regular movement and clear enough for one coast to remain in sight of the other. The route invited passage. This helps explain why place names, speech forms, and later identity in Galloway often look toward Ireland as much as toward the rest of Scotland. The sea between them divided land, but it did not divide people. For centuries it served instead as the road by which new settlers arrived, and old connections endured. That same background also helps explain why later men of Galloway could identify themselves with Ireland as well as Alba. Their memory was not one of recent foreignness, but of kinship. In their own understanding, crossing the sea did not always mean entering a strange land. It could also mean returning to an older world of shared ancestry. That is why the Irish naming of the people of Scotland matters here. It preserved a sense that Western Scotland and parts of Galloway belonged to the same broader Gaelic sphere, even when political borders changed. Later, writers often called the people of Galloway Picts, and still later they were known as the Wild Scots of Galloway. These changing labels did not necessarily mean a complete change of population each time. More often, they show how old names were reused, expanded, or misunderstood. The term Pict in Galloway probably survived because of the old Cruthan element, carried over from Ulster and blended with the Dal Fiatach stock. By the time that label faded and a more openly Scottish identity took its place, the people themselves were already the product of centuries of mixture. The same confusion affects the story of Alpin. His movement toward the southwest has often been described as an invasion of Galloway, but that interpretation is too crude. The people of Argyll and the Irish Scots of Galloway were closely related, not natural enemies. A ruler driven from Argyll had every reason to seek support among kindred communities farther south. His journey makes more sense as an attempt to rally allies than as a straightforward attack on a foreign land. Later chroniclers, writing centuries afterward, turned such episodes into dramatic conquest stories, but the political logic points elsewhere. Even the place of his death has been misunderstood. The event likely took place near the borderland between Ayrshire and the northern edge of what later came to be associated with Galloway, not deep within the district itself. The memory of a stone marking the spot survived, yet even that was later obscured by careless naming and local confusion. Such distortions are typical of the whole subject. A line of verse, a damaged tradition, or a misunderstood place name can create centuries of false certainty. Through all of this, one thing remains clear. Galloway was never an isolated kingdom standing apart from the wider currents of northern history. It was shaped first by native tribes, then by Rome, then by Irish-Scot settlement, later by Strathclyde, and eventually by Norse power and the expanding Scottish monarchy. The idea of an ancient, continuous, independent kingdom of Galloway belongs more to later imagination than to historical fact. Its true history is more complex and far more interesting. Even old customs seem to preserve traces of that mixed, but deeply rooted inheritance. Certain practices surrounding death, wakefulness beside the dead, and household observance continued in Galloway long after other forms of life had changed. Such customs are not proof on their own, but they are cultural echoes. They remind us that beneath later political change, the district retained habits that point back toward the old Gaelic world of the Irish Sea. By the later 4th century, the sea raiders troubling Britain were almost certainly not Saxons in the narrow sense that later history gave to that name. The more convincing explanation is that Roman observers were looking at Scandinavian seafarers and applying the wrong label. In northern waters around that time, the people most likely to appear in fast-moving fleets were Norwegians and other northern seamen, not the inland or semi-coastal groups, later known for their role in England. The mistake is understandable. To Roman writers, the northern world beyond their settled knowledge was often blurred, and names were stretched far beyond their proper meaning. That confusion matters because the early Saxons and Franks were not naturally the kind of hardened ocean raiders they are sometimes made to appear. Their original circumstances do not fit the image of men swarming across every sea in swift and disciplined fleets. The craft associated with them in earlier stages were not vessels suited to the hardest conditions of the Northern Ocean. They could cross the Channel in fair weather, certainly, but they were not the kind of ships that invite confidence in heavy seas, prolonged cruising, and repeated coastal warfare on a wide scale. When Roman authors describe fleets striking boldly in every direction, the picture fits Scandinavians far better than it fits the peoples to whom those writers gave the names Saxon or Frank. Later, experience supports that judgment. Even in the age of Alfred, the Saxon world still did not show an easy mastery of the sea. Alfred had to build ships to defend his coasts, and even then he struggled to find crews good enough to man them properly. Experienced Frisians were needed, men from a people with far stronger maritime habits than the inland Saxons. That detail speaks loudly. A nation truly born to the sea does not discover seamanship so late and so awkwardly. The deeper northern seafaring tradition belonged elsewhere. The Angles present a different but equally important problem. They are often described as a minor people living in a small district in the southeastern part of Schleswig, one tribe among several under the shadow of the Saxons. Yet that explanation is never entirely satisfying. If the Angles had really been so slight and so secondary, their name should have vanished beneath stronger identities. Instead, it survived and eventually gave its name to England itself. That is a remarkable fact. A weak and insignificant tribe does not usually leave its name on an entire country while more powerful neighbours disappear into the background. This suggests that the Angles were either larger, more widespread, or more influential than the traditional picture allows. Some later descriptions reduce their original homeland to a narrow district, little larger than a small English county, but that cannot comfortably explain the scale of their later impact. Such a small corner of land would have struggled to send forth colonists in the numbers later implied. It is more likely that the Angles were not confined to one cramped nook of Schleswig, but were spread across nearby mainland districts and adjacent islands as part of a broader northern population connected to the Scandinavian world. The geography of the region strongly supports that view. The lands associated with the Angles lay in a zone close to islands, narrow seas, and coastal channels. The old traditions preserved in later writings suggest that the people later known in Britain as English had once lived in these northern lands before crossing the sea. That memory is valuable even if it is not contemporary with the migrations themselves. It reflects a remembered movement from a wider Scandinavian border world, rather than from one tiny and isolated patch of ground. Place names in the north also strengthen the impression. Names resembling Angle and Engel appear not only in southern Jutland, but in neighbouring islands and even farther into Scandinavia. That is exactly the sort of pattern expected from a people whose identity had a wider coastal and island base. The history of the Angles in England also points away from the simple idea that they were merely Saxons under another name. Their descendants in the eastern and northern parts of England long showed traits that seemed closer to Danish and Scandinavian habits than to those of the south. Language, local custom, and even physical type were noticed as different. By contrast, the south of England, where Saxon settlement was strongest, preserved a different tone. This division mattered greatly. It suggests that the peoples later grouped together as Anglo-Saxon were never as uniform as later summaries make them sound. The same need for distinction applies to the Jutes. Tradition places them among the earliest permanent settlers in southern Britain, and it credits them with occupying Kent, the Isle of Wight, and part of Hampshire. That may preserve something real, but it should not be accepted too mechanically. The route usually assigned to them is not the most natural one if geography is taken seriously. The northeast coast of Britain offered a far more direct landing for people coming from the Jutland Peninsula. The old story of Jutish settlement in the far south may preserve later arrangements, but it does not necessarily describe the first or fullest movement of that people. Jutland itself was no petty and insignificant corner. Its size, its relation to the sea, and its deeply Scandinavian character all deserve attention. The peninsula formed one of the nearest points of northern Europe to Britain, and with favourable winds the crossing to eastern England was far from impossible. A glance at the map makes that clear. If a people from that region moved in large numbers toward Britain, the northeast coast stands out as one of the most obvious destinations. That is why the later language of northern England becomes so important. Certain northern English forms have long shown unusual resemblance to speech found in Jutland, including words rare or absent elsewhere. This is not what one would expect if the Jutes had only left faint traces in the far south, and then vanished into stronger neighbours. In fact, the old attempt to fold Angles and Jutes neatly into a general Saxon identity has done more to obscure than to clarify the settlement of Britain. The three peoples were often grouped together, but they were not the same. Their homelands, speech patterns, and later influence in Britain differed too much for that. The northern and eastern parts of England developed in ways that cannot be explained by Saxon settlement alone. Scandinavian affinity, whether direct or through closely related northern settlers, was too strong to ignore. This wider question leads naturally to the making of England itself. Southern Britain was eventually divided into the familiar kingdoms of early English history, but the final union took centuries. If the Saxons had truly been the overwhelmingly dominant settlers from the beginning, the country might well have taken a name from them. Yet, it did not. The name that endured was tied to the Angles. That fact alone should warn against any narrative that makes the Saxons the sole or unquestioned masters of the process. In the north, the story was even more complicated. Northumbria did not simply arise as an easy Saxon extension. It grew through war, pressure, and repeated contests with British kingdoms that remained powerful long after the first settlements in the south. Ida is remembered as one of the major founders of northern power, and his kingdom of Bernicia was built in a frontier zone where different races and traditions met. Bernicia itself stood north of the Roman wall, while Dira lay farther south. Together they formed the basis of what became Northumbria, but even that larger kingdom was not a stable and uncontested power from the first. Its expansion into what is now southern Scotland was real, but its permanence has often been exaggerated. Bernician kings could raid, overrun, and temporarily dominate neighbouring regions. Yet that was not the same as secure and lasting possession. The Lothians, western districts, and parts of the southwest all lay within a zone of repeated conflict, and later, writers too often mistook momentary superiority for settled rule. After major reverses, especially in the later 7th century, northern English power in Scotland contracted sharply. Claims that it remained deep and secure beyond the Tweed are difficult to sustain. The same overstatement appears in relation to Galloway. Some later accounts treat it as though it had long lain under Bernician or Northumbrian rule. But the political and geographical realities argue against such simplicity. Galloway belonged to the wider kingdom of Strathclyde, and that kingdom had its own kings, its own political life, and its own continuity. It cannot be turned into a mere appendage of Northumbria without doing violence to the evidence. If one part of Strathclyde is acknowledged as possessing its own rulers and resisting external control, it becomes highly unlikely that Galloway alone lay quietly subdued beneath a permanent foreign yoke. The same problem appears in the interpretation of campaigns by English kings into the north. A joint invasion or a temporary seizure of a stronghold has too often been treated as if it established lasting authority over an entire country. In reality, these expeditions were often destructive rather than administrative. They broke resistance, plundered, burned, and withdrew. They did not necessarily leave a functioning apparatus of rule behind them. This distinction is essential for understanding both Strathclyde and Galloway. The Old British Kingdom remained alive long after such attacks, and its royal line continued without the kind of interruption that would suggest real absorption into England. Even in the 10th century, later writers have sometimes pushed the claims too far. A grant of Cumberland to a Scottish king has been extended in some interpretations into a gift of all Cumbria, including Galloway and the wider Strathclyde realm. But the original sense is narrower. The reference concerns Cumberland, not the whole kingdom of Strathclyde. To turn that act into the transfer of a much larger country is to read beyond the wording and against the political realities of the time. Strathclyde still existed. Its kingship was not a fiction, and Galloway remained part of that northern British world. The kingdom of Strathclyde itself deserves far more attention than it often receives. It may well have been the earliest clearly formed kingdom within the territory, later known as Scotland after Roman rule faded. Its centre lay at the great rock of Alclwyd, later called Dumbarton, where a strong fortress commanded the Clyde. The people of the kingdom were described under several names across time, including Britons, Cumbrians, and Welsh, but the political entity remained identifiable for centuries. It was not a vague memory, but a real state with a remembered line of rulers. The royal sequence begins in shadow, but not in complete darkness. Early kings are named, and whether every detail about them is secure or not, the line itself is too coherent to be dismissed. These rulers governed a country that faced pressure from many sides, yet maintained its identity across generations. At times, it was strong enough to repel invaders. At other times, it suffered reverses and saw its enemies enter the heart of its territory, but it endured. Even its defeats reveal its significance, because powerful coalitions were needed to strike at its capital. This continuing vitality helps explain why temporary Northumbrian successes cannot be mistaken for total conquest. There were moments when Bernician kings were said to have power over the Britons of Strathclyde, but such power was likely nominal, uncertain, or short-lived. A frontier overlordship is not the same as full absorption. The kingdom continued to produce kings after these moments, and its own political life remained visible. The record does not support the idea of a land wholly swallowed by English rule. At times, outside attacks came not only from the east, but from Ireland. There are scattered notices of incursions from Ulster into the western side of Britain. And though the details are not always clear, they again show that the Irish Sea and western coasts formed one connected world of conflict and movement. Galloway's place within Strathclyde would naturally expose it to such pressure. This is one more reason why the history of the district cannot be reduced to an English story. Its ties to Ulster, to British Strathclyde, and later to Norse power all mattered profoundly. The later weakening of Strathclyde opened the way for yet another force, one even more decisive for the history of Galloway. That force was the Norse. Once their role is understood, much confusion falls away. A great many earlier statements about Saxons in the north begin to look like misidentifications. The real maritime power pressing into the Irish Sea, the western coasts, the islands, and eventually deep into Galloway, was Scandinavian. Norse fleets, not Saxon ones, fit the evidence of seamanship, shipbuilding, and the pattern of movement along dangerous coasts. This also helps explain why supposed traces of long Anglo-Saxon occupation in Galloway are so weak. The evidence usually cited is slight and often misunderstood. The brief establishment of bishops tied to the Anglo Church does not prove lasting secular rule. Ecclesiastical dependence and political dependence are not the same thing. Religious influence could cross frontiers in ways that armies and kings could not. The Church of Iona had once influenced Northumbria without making it politically subject to Western Scotland. In the same way, later church arrangements linking Galloway southward do not automatically turn the district into English land. The place names often used to support Anglo-Saxon control are even more doubtful. Several of them have been interpreted through the wrong linguistic lens. Names thought to reflect English or Saxon settlers may in fact preserve Norse meanings or later corruptions of Gaelic forms. Once Norse rule in Galloway is acknowledged, many of these names become easier to explain. What had been treated as evidence of a Saxon province begins to look instead like the mark of Scandinavian domination and later confusion among antiquarians. Architectural remains tell a similar story. Certain structures once called Saxon bear a much stronger resemblance to Norse work. A fine arch at Wythorn and other features in the region sit more comfortably within a Norse artistic and building tradition than within the supposed remains of an early English colony. Comparison with unmistakably Norse monuments elsewhere in the north makes this especially persuasive. The builders who left those marks in Galloway were far more likely to have belonged to the Scandinavian world than to a lost Anglo-Saxon ruling class. By the middle of the 10th century, Strathclyde stood near the end of its long independent life, though not yet wholly erased. The old British kingdom had already been weakened by repeated attacks, and Norse power was becoming a major reality in the West. That shift is crucial. It helps explain why certain districts that had once belonged securely within the Strathclyde orbit became contested or transformed. Cumberland itself passed through changing hands and changing loyalties, while Galloway increasingly felt the pressure of Scandinavian dominance. The old notion that Galloway had been a kingdom in its own right throughout these centuries does not survive close examination. Geography, politics, and the surviving record all point another way. First, it was part of the Roman frontier world. Then, it belonged within the sphere of Strathclyde. Later, it came under strong Norse influence and, for a time, Norse rule. Only afterward was it absorbed fully into the expanding Kingdom of Scotland. The habit of pulling it out of that sequence and treating it as a permanently separate realm has caused endless confusion. The line of Strathclyde kings shows the continuity of the kingdom more clearly than any theory can. Whatever uncertainty remains around individual names and dates, the broad fact is unmistakable. A kingdom with its own remembered rulers endured there for centuries. It was not an occasional rebellion under English masters, nor a mere province waiting to be handed from one neighbouring king to another. Its rulers fought, allied, lost ground, regained influence, and survived deep into the early medieval period. Galloway shared in that history because it lay within the same larger political body. The capture of Alclwyd in the 8th century by a combined enemy force stands as one of the great shocks in that history. It was not the fall of a trivial stronghold. It took the pressure of two powerful rulers acting together to break into the heart of the kingdom. Even then, the blow didn't instantly erase Strathclyde, but it weakened it enough to make later Norse inroads easier. In that sense, the path toward the Scandinavian domination of western districts, including Galloway, was being prepared well before the final collapse of the old British order. Once this sequence is kept clear, the historical picture becomes much more coherent. The Sea Raiders, wrongly called Saxons by some Roman and later writers, were in large measure Norsemen. The Angles were a distinct and influential people whose northern character shaped much of England. The Jutes were not a vanished footnote, but part of the wider Scandinavian border world, whose traces remained strongest in the north and east. Brigantian and Northumbrian power in Scotland was real, but often overstated. Strathclyde was a true kingdom, not a political illusion, and Galloway belonged within that kingdom until later transformations, not beneath an ancient and continuous Anglo-Saxon rule. After the reign of Elphin, the succession in Strathclyde continued through rulers, whose names survive only in scattered traditions. Yet the line itself remained unbroken enough to show that the kingdom was still alive. Conan, son of Rurach, appears next and is remembered as a king of the Britons, dying in the early 9th century. He was followed by Artag, or Arlaga, under whom later writers claimed that an English king had overrun Strathclyde and planted settlements there. That claim does not stand firmly. Raids and devastation are easy to believe, but permanent settlement is another matter. The record does not convincingly show that Strathclyde was broken or colonised at that stage. On the contrary, the kingdom clearly remained independent for decades afterward. Its greatest danger came not from that quarter, but from across the Western Sea. In the later 9th century, Alcluyd, the fortress city at the heart of the kingdom, was attacked by the Danes, operating from Ireland. The siege lasted for months, which already says much about the strength of the place and the importance attached to it. When the stronghold finally fell, the invaders ravaged the surrounding land and carried many captives back to Dublin. Yet even this was not the immediate end of the kingdom. The attack weakened Strathclyde badly, but it did not erase it. The Norse assaults of this period were often devastating without instantly becoming full colonization. They shattered confidence, drained manpower, and damaged royal authority. But the political body itself could still stagger on. Artag was killed amid these struggles, and his son Rune followed him. Around this time, the kingdom appears under a Welsh name, meaning the Welsh of Strathclyde, which is important because it shows how contemporaries still recognised it as a distinct British realm. In the same general period, a Danish force moved south from Northumbria and plundered as far as the district later known as Galloway, ravaging that land as well as other parts of the Strathclyde sphere. These attacks must have deepened the kingdom's weakness, but they still belong to a phase of violent pressure rather than orderly replacement. Rune left a son named Eochaid, though for a time another figure, Grig, seems to have acted as guardian or governor, and may even have taken power into his own hands. Later tradition credited him with recovering southern districts and with freeing Galloway from the rule of the Angles. That story is difficult to accept in the form it was handed down. The district south of the Solway was not truly part of Strathclyde in the way later writers imagined, and Galloway was not living under a settled Anglian yoke from which it needed dramatic liberation. Such language belongs more to later reconstruction than to the realities of the time. By this stage, the deeper struggle in the southwest was not one between Galloway and English masters, but between the older British population, the incoming Irish Scots, and the wider Norse pressure reshaping the western coasts. This is where one of the most important turning points in the history of Galloway appears. In the later 9th century, the old British population of the southwest, linked to the broader Cymric world, seems to have been pushed aside decisively. The evidence points to a major displacement, rather than a slow and peaceful blending alone. The native element did not vanish in an instant, but the balance changed. Those who would not submit to the new order were eventually driven out or chose to leave. Their flight survives in traditions that tell of men of Strathclyde abandoning their country and seeking refuge in Wales. This was not a random wandering of broken people. It appears to have been the final stage of a longer crisis created by conquest, pressure, and demographic change in the southwest. The district most clearly involved in that process was Galloway. The older British inhabitants there had already been under strain for some time. Irish Scots from Ulster had been crossing in increasing numbers and establishing themselves across the district over generations. At a certain point, that movement stopped being only immigration and became domination. There is even a tradition that the decisive settlement in Galloway was secured by stratagem and violence, with leading local men being slain. Whether the details are exact or not, the broader picture is convincing. The old Cymric population of Galloway was forced into retreat, and many of those who refused subjection fled south and west, eventually finding room in Wales where they were settled in districts, recovered from Saxon pressure. That exodus matters enormously because it helps explain several otherwise confusing traditions. It shows why the British identity of Strathclyde remained strong in name while weakening in territory. It also explains how Galloway, once within the orbit of the British kingdom, gradually ceased to be British in character. The new dominant element there was Irish Scot, brought from Ulster over time. This change did not happen in 1 year, but by the late 9th century its effects had become clear enough to force a decisive migration of the older population. The situation in Cumberland was related, though not identical. There too British populations were suffering under repeated pressure, but the driving force was more directly Norse. Cumberland and Galloway were both destabilised, yet by different combinations of enemies. In Galloway, the Irish-Scot advance was central. In Cumberland, Scandinavian power became more decisive. These developments ran alongside one another and helped break apart the wider British world of the northwest. Back in Strathclyde itself, the line of kings continued despite all of this. A ruler named Donald is said to have died around the start of the 10th century and is remembered as the last king who could claim Roman descent. Whether that claim was exact or not, it reflects something entirely plausible. Roman blood hadn't vanished from the old frontier lands. Roman soldiers hadn't all left without descendants, and the long occupation had certainly left mixed populations behind. In a frontier kingdom like Strathclyde, where identities had long been layered and complex, such a memory is not surprising. Donald was followed by another Donald, and then by a ruler remembered under forms such as Eugenius, Owen, or Ewan. During his reign, southern chroniclers began making grand claims about English overlordship across almost all Britain. One English king was said to have been chosen as father and lord not only by Scots and Northumbrians, but also by the king and people of the Strathclyde Welsh. Such statements are classic examples of inflated political language. They tell more about English royal ambition and literary style than about actual command over the northern kingdoms. Temporary submission, diplomatic acknowledgement, or strategic agreements might well have occurred. But that was not the same as real absorption. The men of Strathclyde did not cease to have a king, nor did their kingdom dissolve into England, because an English chronicler framed an event in the loftiest possible terms. The same exaggeration appears again and again in southern records. Kings are said to have subdued entire peoples, only for those same peoples to resist, recover, or fight again a few years later. The pattern is familiar. A raid, a victory, a treaty, or a forced acknowledgement becomes, in English narrative, universal submission. The reality was usually much less complete. This is especially clear in the case of the North, where Scots, Cumbrians, Danes, Northmen, and British kings remained active powers rather than obedient subjects. The later kings of Strathclyde continue to prove that the kingdom still mattered. One Donald died in the mid-10th century and was followed by another ruler, whose name survives in forms closer to the old British tradition. In his reign, the kingdom was still capable of campaigning eastward and fighting major battles against the northern Scots and Picts. In one such encounter, Strathclyde forces defeated their enemies and killed a leading ruler. That is not the action of a dead state. It shows a kingdom that, though weakened, still possessed real military force and political ambition. The reverse came not long after, when the same Strathclyde ruler was defeated in battle by the northern Scots and Picts, and then withdrew to Rome, where he died. Such a fate gives the period an almost tragic character. The kingship still existed, but its strength was fading. The kingdom could strike, but it could no longer sustain its older power. It had become reactive, exposed, and increasingly hemmed in by stronger neighbours, and by the long consequences of earlier invasions. The final king is remembered as Eochaid, sometimes called the Bald. He appears in connection with the great wars of the early 11th century, and was still alive at the time of the famous Battle of Carrum. When he died, the independent line of Strathclyde effectively ended. The kingdom that had once been one of the major powers of post-Roman northern Britain was gone. With its collapse, Galloway passed more fully into the hands of the Norsemen, while Cumberland, on the other side of the Solway, was under the same broad Scandinavian influence. This was the true aftermath of Strathclyde's fall, not the simple inheritance of the district by one neighbouring king or another. At this point, later writers created yet another confusion by trying to turn Galloway into an ancient independent kingdom of its own. Some even invented kings for it at an impossibly early date. One chronicler speaks of a king of Galloway attending an English royal display in the 10th century, as though the district already existed by that name as a separate sovereignty. The problem is not merely that the evidence is weak. It is that the statement collides with everything else known about the region. Galloway was not yet standing alone as a clearly defined kingdom with its own long line of rulers. It was part of the larger Strathclyde world, later, overtaken by Norse power and only afterward shaped into the political form familiar from medieval history. The story of English kings receiving homage from northern rulers is another field where exaggeration and confusion piled up quickly. One chronicler lists named rulers, another lists a different set, and the oldest record gives only a number without any names at all. Later, writers expanded the scene into a theatrical display, turning a diplomatic gathering into a symbolic pageant of universal submission. In one version, the King of Scots, the ruler of the Cumbrians, island lords and others, rode an English king in triumph along the River Dee while he held the helm. It is a striking image, but the more dramatic the story becomes, the less trustworthy it appears. The whole tone belongs to royal glorification, not sober historical reporting. Even where a kernel of truth survives, it was almost certainly something narrower. A local settlement, a treaty, or the holding of a contested district on certain conditions could later be stretched into language of total overlordship. The case of Cumberland is a good example. What may have been a grant or recognition tied to one border region later became, in inflated retellings, the submission of whole peoples and kingdoms. Once again, the language of conquest outran the fact. The weakness of these later narratives becomes even clearer when they begin to attach names like Galloway too early, or create royal titles that do not fit the political geography of the age. Some of these writers lived centuries after the events they described and had no direct knowledge of the places in question. They wrote from monasteries far from the southwest of Scotland, relying on earlier fragments, misunderstanding local names, or simply reshaping the past into something more orderly and impressive. When these inventions were repeated by later historians without close scrutiny, they hardened into supposed facts. Another source of confusion came from similar-sounding names in Irish material. Terms that referred to mixed peoples, or foreign Gaels in Ireland, were later misunderstood as references to Galloway. This is a serious error. Words that look like they point to the district may in fact belong entirely to Irish conditions and Irish political geography. When such mistakes are carried back into Scottish history, they create false links and imaginary kingdoms. What makes the problem worse is the general style of many medieval chronicles. They habitually magnified the prestige of kings, especially English kings, and turned limited political arrangements into sweeping claims of supremacy. A treaty becomes submission. A raid becomes conquest. A temporary ally becomes a permanent vassal. This habit must be remembered constantly when reading narratives about the North. Without that caution, every English advance begins to look final, even when the kingdoms supposedly subdued are found fighting independently soon afterward. The case of Strathclyde shows the truth more clearly than any theory. Its line of kings continued for centuries. Its capital was attacked, taken, and retaken in memory. Its armies fought major battles. Its people migrated, resisted, and endured. Its districts, including Galloway, were transformed by pressure from Irish Scots and Norsemen rather than simply handed from one English king to another. The kingdom's end came through long attrition, not through a single act of southern mastery. After Strathclyde collapsed, a darker and less clearly recorded phase begins in the history of Galloway. This is the period when Norse influence becomes unmistakable and, in all probability, dominant. The silence in the sources has tempted many writers to fill the gap with easy assumptions, but the material evidence and the wider pattern of Western history point firmly toward a substantial Norse occupation. The castles along the coast were not built merely for passing visits. The strategic sites, the maritime logic, and the broader Norse control of neighbouring seas all suggest something much stronger than occasional raiding. Galloway was too valuable, too exposed, and too closely linked to the roots between Ireland, Man, the Hebrides, and the Solway to escape serious Scandinavian rule. To understand that development properly, the wider northern world has to be kept in view. The Scandinavians were not an accidental late force appearing out of nowhere in the British seas. Their maritime skill, their shipbuilding, and their habit of long-distance movement had deep roots. Ancient writers already knew of powerful northern peoples, whose ships were unlike those of the Mediterranean world. Those descriptions fit the Scandinavian tradition far better than they fit the inland Germans, whom Roman writers often confused with them. The northern ship was a different kind of instrument, built for rougher waters and bolder movement. The Norwegians were especially formidable in this respect. Their Atlantic coastline trained them in a harsher school than most European peoples ever knew. They became the boldest sailors of the north, but they were not alone. Danes and Swedes were also seasoned seamen and dangerous fighters. Together, these Scandinavian peoples created the maritime power that transformed the Western seas. Their ships were not primitive coastal craft. They ranged from long, fast war vessels to the great dragon-prowed ships that later memory preserved with awe. Some carried hundreds of men. These were fleets designed not merely to cross short channels, but to dominate whole seaways. That is why the old habit of calling many northern raiders Saxons is so misleading. The Franks and Saxons did not belong to the same maritime world. However fierce they may have been on land, their tradition was not one of oceanic mastery. Roman writers, unfamiliar with the full diversity of the North, blurred together peoples who were very different in way of life. later writers inherited the confusion. The result was a long misuse of names that hid the real role of the Scandinavians in Britain and Ireland. The Scandinavian world itself was not simple. Ancient northern Europe contained several small kingdoms, before larger identities emerged. Over time, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes became the leading names, but the Angles and Jutes also belong to the same broad northern environment and cannot simply be treated as Germans of the same kind as the Saxons. Language alone does not settle such questions. Peoples can change speech, absorb one another, or borrow names without preserving pure descent. Europe is full of such examples. Race, language, and political label do not always move together. The same is true in the British Isles. A people may retain older blood while speaking a new tongue, or carry a mixed ancestry under a single later name. This is one reason why the Scandinavian element has often been underestimated. The Norse did not always leave a population visibly separate from those around them. They mixed, settled, ruled, traded, married, and reshaped the societies they entered. Their identity could dissolve into a wider population, while their influence remained immense. In Ireland, their position was especially strong. They founded and held towns, built up trading centres, and established lasting communities. They were known there as Eastern Men, a name reflecting their point of arrival rather than a narrow ethnic distinction. Dublin became one of their chief bases, but it was not the only one. Their settlements spread across the island, and though their power was challenged and sometimes broken in battle, they were never simply expelled. They remained part of the fabric of Ireland. The same wider Scandinavian force must be kept in mind when looking at Galloway. Once Strathclyde weakened and the British element was pushed out of the district, Galloway lay open to a maritime power perfectly suited to seize it. The Norse were already active in Ireland, in Man, in the Isles, in Cumberland, and along the western seaways. A full occupation of Galloway is not only possible, it is the most coherent explanation of the evidence. The district's later history, its place names, its fortifications, and its strategic role all point in that direction. This is the real setting in which Galloway passed from a British district within Strathclyde to something else entirely. First came Irish-Scots settlement and the displacement of the older Cymric population. Then came Norse domination, which overlaid that Gaelic southwestern world with a new maritime and military order. Only after these phases did Galloway move toward its later place, within the Kingdom of Scotland. Any account that skips these stages or turns the district into an ancient independent kingdom from the beginning misses the real drama of its past. In the centuries when Scandinavian expansion reached the British Isles, Norwegian settlers played the leading role in shaping many of the northern regions. Their presence extended across Scotland, Ireland, and large parts of northern England. By the time the Norman conquest transformed England in the 11th century, the population along much of the eastern coastline, particularly around York and Lincoln, had become heavily Scandinavian in origin. These communities were not simply small groups of raiders who passed through the region. They were settlers who left lasting marks on the land, its language, and its customs. Ireland offers another revealing example of how these northern settlers behaved after they established themselves. The Norwegians and Danes who arrived there often fought among themselves for control of territory and trade routes. These struggles resemble the pattern already familiar in Irish political life, where rival chiefs frequently competed for power. Over time, the Scandinavian settlers adopted elements of the local culture, and their conflicts began to resemble those of the Irish themselves. Yet, despite this blending of habits, their material culture remained distinctive. Weapons discovered in Ireland from this period often display clear Scandinavian craftsmanship, and are frequently superior to locally made examples. Swords discovered in archaeological finds range from about 2 to nearly 3 feet in length, sometimes double-edged and sometimes single-edged, usually equipped with a guard and a large pommel at the end of the hilt. These weapons reveal the skill and martial traditions that the northern warriors brought with them. The Scandinavian influence also reached deep into the linguistic and cultural fabric of northern Britain. Observers have long noticed that the traditional speech of the Scottish lowlands bears a striking resemblance to the languages of Scandinavia. Sailors from Scotland who had been shipwrecked on the coasts of Norway or Jutland were reportedly able to communicate with local people surprisingly easily. This similarity suggests that the languages once shared a close relationship before centuries of change altered them. In fact, the everyday speech of the lowlands preserved many words and expressions of Scandinavian origin, sometimes even more than the dialects spoken in northern England. The cultural connection did not stop with language. Northern England and the Scottish lowlands both preserve traces of Scandinavian heritage in traditional songs and folklore. These similarities are especially noticeable in Scotland, where large numbers of Northmen settled over time. The language of Iceland provides another clue to these historical ties. Icelandic developed in relative isolation and preserved many features of early Scandinavian speech. When it is compared with older forms of Scottish language, the resemblance becomes clear. Differences in spelling and pronunciation exist, but the underlying structure often remains close enough to show how easily the two could once interact. Some writers have suggested that the poetic traditions of Scandinavia contributed to the distinctive character of Scottish verse. The wild and dramatic tone found in many Scottish traditions may partly reflect this northern heritage, intensified by the presence of Celtic culture. Music offers another example. Certain Scandinavian musical patterns resemble those preserved in Scottish folk music, suggesting that the traditions of the North helped shape the soundscape of medieval Scotland. A remarkable trait of the Scandinavian settlers was their ability to adapt quickly to the lands they entered. Wherever they settled, they often adopted local customs and sometimes even abandoned their original language in favour of the speech of the surrounding population. Yet, even when they assimilated in this way, they tended to preserve a strong sense of identity. Their symbols and traditions continued to appear long after their arrival. One of the most famous of these emblems was the Raven Banner, a symbol carried by northern warriors for centuries. It inspired fear and superstition across the British Isles and remained in use long after many Scandinavian rulers had converted to Christianity. Eventually, the symbol was replaced by the heraldic lion, a figure that later appeared in the coats of arms of several Scandinavian kingdoms. The lion emblem became a lasting sign of royal authority in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The earliest reference to Scandinavian raiders appearing in the waters around Britain come from early medieval chronicles. These sources describe ships arriving from the western coast of Norway. Irish and Welsh records place their first major raids on Irish shores near the end of the 8th century. These accounts describe attacks on monasteries and islands, including sites in the Hebrides and on the Isle of Man. Monastic communities were particularly vulnerable because they possessed wealth but little defence. By the early 9th century, the raids had intensified. Settlements were soon established along parts of the Irish coast. Important religious centres such as Iona suffered repeated attacks. Within a few decades, Scandinavian influence had become so strong that major cities like Dublin fell under Norse control. By the middle of the 9th century, fleets of Scandinavian ships filled the waters around Ireland, transforming the political and economic landscape of the region. At roughly the same time, Norwegian kings were expanding their authority across the islands of the North Atlantic. The Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and several other island groups were brought under their influence. Norse leaders also pushed northward along the Scottish mainland. Regions such as Caithness and Sutherland fell under Scandinavian control, and their rulers extended their influence across large sections of northern Scotland. One of the most powerful figures of this era was the Norse ruler Thorfinn. Through inheritance, conquest, and strategic alliances, he gained control over extensive territories. These included the Orkney and Shetland Islands, large areas of northern Scotland, and parts of the Western Seaways. His power stretched across a network of maritime territories that connected Scotland, Ireland, and the island chains of the North Atlantic. The reach of Norse influence across Scotland during this period was remarkable. Place names across the northern and western coasts still preserve the memory of these settlers. Many islands, headlands, and coastal features bear names derived from the Old Norse language. Even where the original inhabitants remained on the land, the Norse often ruled as overlords, turning the local population into subjects, while establishing themselves as the dominant power. These developments help explain an otherwise puzzling gap in the historical record of Galloway. After the decline of the Kingdom of Strathclyde, the history of this southwestern region becomes obscure for a time. Yet the pattern of Norse expansion across the surrounding seas strongly suggests that Galloway was drawn into the same network of Scandinavian influence that shaped nearby territories. Fortified coastal sites in the region hint at a period of Norse control, as these strongholds were unlikely to have been built without political domination of the surrounding land. One Norse leader associated with Galloway in the early 11th century was a figure remembered as Earl Malcolm. His residence has often been linked with a stronghold near Whithorn. Around this same period, the Kingdom of Strathclyde came to an end, leaving Galloway open to new powers. The timing of these events suggests that Norse rulers were already established in the region before the final collapse of the older British Kingdom. The Norse sagas describe episodes that reinforce this picture. They speak of fleets sailing into the Solway region and wintering near Whithorn, where Scandinavian leaders spent time among their allies. These accounts indicate that Norse influence had become firmly rooted in the southwestern coast of Scotland by the early 11th century. Another powerful figure of the period was Thorfinn, whose authority eventually extended across a wide range of territories. His dominion included several regions of northern Scotland as well as Galloway itself. He commanded fleets capable of launching expeditions into both England and Ireland. During the summer months, he often operated from bases in the south, while winter was spent farther north in the Orkneys, or along the Caithness coast. Thorfinn's political career reveals how interconnected the regions of the North Atlantic had become. Alliances were formed between Norse rulers in Scotland and leaders from Norway and the islands. These alliances allowed them to launch coordinated campaigns across the Irish Sea and the British coasts. Battles between rival Scandinavian factions were also common, reflecting the intense competition for power among the Sea Kings. Eventually, Thorfinn travelled to Rome, seeking absolution for the violence that had marked his life as a warrior. His journey shows how far the influence of Christianity had spread across northern Europe by this time. Even rulers who had once led fierce pagan warriors began to adopt the institutions and beliefs of the Christian world. After Thorfinn's death, other leaders attempted to claim authority across parts of Britain and Ireland. Some sources describe Norse rulers presenting themselves as kings of British territories once associated with Strathclyde. These claims reflect the fluid political landscape of the time, when Norse, Gaelic, and British forces all competed for influence across the Western Seas. Later, Norse rulers continued to play a role in the politics of the region. One of the most famous was Magnus Barefoot, the Norwegian king who launched campaigns across the Irish Sea in the late 11th century. His expeditions brought him to the coasts of Scotland and the islands of the Hebrides. During these campaigns, he compelled local populations to assist in building fortifications and naval bases along the coast. Despite these dramatic events, the Norse presence did not remain permanent everywhere. Over time, their settlements merged with local populations, leaving behind cultural and linguistic traces rather than independent Scandinavian kingdoms. Yet in certain regions, including parts of Western Scotland, their influence endured for generations. Evidence of Scandinavian occupation in Galloway also survives in place, names scattered across the landscape. One of the most intriguing examples is the name Borland, which appears repeatedly in the region. The meaning of the word becomes clearer when compared with similar terms found in Norse territories. In the Orkney Islands, lands known as Bordlands were properties reserved for the use of local rulers when they travelled through their domains. These estates were often exempt from certain taxes because they served the needs of the ruling household. Records from the Northern Islands show that these lands were recognised as part of the estates belonging to the earls who governed the region. They were used as official stopping places where rulers and their followers could stay during journeys across their territories. The appearance of the same term in Galloway strongly suggests a similar system once existed there. The widespread presence of such place names across southwestern Scotland reinforces the idea that Scandinavian authority once shaped the region's landscape. Farms and estates bearing names derived from Norse terminology are found across the countryside, particularly in coastal districts that were closely connected with the maritime roots of the Norse world. These traces may seem small, but together they reveal an important chapter in the history of the region. They show that Galloway did not stand apart from the broader transformation that swept across the northern seas during the Viking Age. Instead, it formed part of a vast network linking Norway, the British Isles, and Ireland through trade, warfare, and settlement. In the northern and western parts of the British Isles, the Norwegians seem to have been the strongest Scandinavian settlers, leaving the deepest mark in Scotland, in Ireland, and across much of northern England. By the time of the Norman conquest, large stretches of the eastern side of England, especially around York and Lincoln, had become heavily Scandinavian in character. These were not just passing raiders. They were settlers, landholders, warriors, traders, and rulers whose presence reshaped entire regions. In Ireland, their political behaviour soon began to resemble that of the country they had entered. Danes and Norwegians fought one another repeatedly for power, territory, and prestige, and in doing so they seem almost to have absorbed the very spirit of the island. The rivalry, fragmentation, and restless ambition that already defined Irish politics drew them in as well. Yet even where they adapted, they did not arrive empty-handed. Their weapons, their ships, and their maritime discipline were superior in many respects. Swords found in Ireland from this period, long, well-balanced, and carefully made, show the technical strength they brought with them. They did not merely join the struggle. They altered its scale. The linguistic mark of these northern settlers was just as important as their military one. The speech of the Scottish lowlands preserves so many Scandinavian words and expressions that it often seemed to stand much closer to the languages of the north than many expected. There are old observations that Scottish sailors, wrecked along the coasts of Jutland or Norway, could make themselves understood there with surprising ease, speaking in their own tongue. Whether every such story is exact or not, the deeper truth is difficult to miss. The lowland language kept a remarkable Scandinavian layer within it, even more strongly in some ways than the speech of northern England. Traditional songs and folk memory carried the same influence. In the north of England, these connections can still be felt, but in the Scottish lowlands they seem in some respects even more pronounced, shaped by repeated arrivals of Northmen and by long contact over centuries. Icelandic, because it preserved Old Northern speech in a purer form than many mainland languages, offers another clue. When compared with older Scottish forms, the kinship becomes easier to see. Much of what later sounded different was often a matter of spelling and pronunciation, rather than complete separation. The cultural force of Scandinavia may also have sharpened the tone of Scottish tradition itself. Some of the wildness, intensity, and stern energy that appear in older Scottish poetry may owe part of their character to this northern inheritance deepened further by the Celtic element already present. Even music seems to hint at the same connection. The scales and melodic habits of old Scandinavian music have often been noticed as strikingly close to those found in Scotland. These were not superficial coincidences. They belong to a world in which people, stories, words, and sounds cross the sea as readily as fleets and armies. One of the most important qualities of the Scandinavians was their readiness to adapt without losing themselves entirely. They often took on the customs of the lands they entered, and in some places even forgot their original speech, yet they still preserved a distinct national stamp. Their symbols survived long after conversion and settlement had changed much else. For centuries, the raven banner, feared across the British Isles and elsewhere, remained a sign of northern power. Even after the old pagan world faded, the memory of that emblem lingered. In time, it gave way to the lion, which became a royal symbol in the northern kingdoms. But the older image had already left its mark on imagination and legend. The first clearly recorded Norse attacks in the Western Seas appear in early medieval annals, and they are commonly linked to the later 8th century. Their ships came from the western coast of Norway, and their first blows fell upon monasteries, islands, and coastal settlements. Ireland and Wales record them as appearing around the same time, and by the end of the 8th century, they had struck religious communities in Man and the Hebrides. A few years later, the great monastic house at Iona suffered repeated attacks. These early raids were only the beginning. By the opening years of the 9th century, there were already Scandinavian settlements in Ireland, and before long one of the great ecclesiastical centres of that island appears associated with a Norse leader. Then Dublin itself passed into Scandinavian hands. From that point onward, the Irish Sea and the western approaches to Britain became a Norse world in a very real sense. Their power spread quickly across the northern and western islands. Norwegian kings and jarls brought the Hebrides, Man, and many neighbouring districts under their authority. Northern Scotland was drawn in as well. Caithness, Sutherland, Ross, Moray, and wide stretches of the coast and islands came under Scandinavian domination. The old sagas describe rulers who held these regions not as scattered raiders, but as territorial lords, men whose authority ran through islands, mainland districts, and sea routes alike. The picture that emerges is one of organised maritime power, not random attack. This wider Scandinavian setting explains what happened in Galloway far better than the older theories ever did. Once the kingdom of Strathclyde faded, the history of Galloway appears to fall strangely silent. Yet that silence is only misleading if it is taken at face value. The region did not become empty or politically unimportant. It passed into a new world of control, one shaped by Norse rulers whose interests stretched from Orkney and Caithness to Man, Dublin, and the western coasts. The castles and fortified points along the Galloway shore make sense in that context. They were not decorative outposts or isolated strongholds built against nothing. They belonged to a system of rule. They were raised because the district had been subdued, because it mattered, and because the Sea Kings intended to hold it. One of the earliest clearly named Norse figures associated with Galloway is Earl Malcolm, who appears in connection with Wythorn in the early 11th century. His residence is generally linked with the fortress, later known as Cruggleton. At that time, Iogan the Bald was still remembered as the last king of Strathclyde, dying only a few years later. The overlap is important. It shows that Norse rule in Galloway had already begun before the final shadow of Strathclyde disappeared. There was no long empty interval. The old British kingdom failed, and the Norse were already in place. The sagas preserve glimpses of this southern rule. One passage describes northern warriors sailing into the Solway region and wintering in Galloway with Earl Malcolm. That small detail is powerful because it shows Galloway not as a distant target of occasional plunder, but as a settled base within the Norse sphere. Soon afterward, the district was drawn more fully into the dominion of Thorfinn, one of the greatest Norse rulers in the northern seas. Thorfinn's power was extraordinary. By inheritance, alliance, and war, he gathered a realm that stretched across Caithness, Sutherland, Ross, Moray, much of northern and western Scotland, the islands, and Galloway itself. He also had influence in Ireland and raided England. He was not a local chief, but a maritime prince ruling through movement, force, and a chain of territories tied together by sea. Some traditions speak of him holding 9 or even more earldoms in Scotland, as well as the western islands and lands beyond. Whether every number is exact matters less than the clear impression his authority was vast, and Galloway formed part of it. At one stage he allied himself with other Norse leaders and used their combined strength to extend his power still further. The sagas speak of him launching campaigns into England and Ireland, operating in summer from the south and spending winters in the north. His life belonged to the rhythm of a sea ruler, shifting between islands, mainland holdings, and war zones. The old poems made in his honour even claim that his dominion stretched from the far north of Scotland to Dublin. That is the scale on which his rule must be understood. The evidence that Galloway belonged to this world is too strong to dismiss. One important saga passage, preserved imperfectly in later copies, but recoverable through an earlier translation, makes it clear that Thorfinn lay in a place called Gadjadlar, while carrying out warfare in the Hebrides and western Scotland. That place can only be Galloway. The corrupted spelling in the surviving Norse material had long caused confusion, but once the damaged text was restored, the sense became plain. Galloway was not a vague frontier beyond his reach. It was one of the centres from which he operated. This alone transforms the understanding of the district. It also explains why so many earlier historians failed to read the region correctly. They were determined to trace later lordship in Galloway back through native or semi-native lines, and so overlooked the period when the district was under Norse command. Yet the character of the people, the placement of the fortresses, the naming of lands, and the broader political pattern all point in the same direction. The Norse did not merely touch the coast, they ruled the region. After Thorfinn, Norse influence remained strong. Other sea kings claimed authority in the western world of Britain and Ireland. One of them appears in Irish record as ruler over the Britons, the foreign islands, and Dublin. This does not necessarily mean direct rule in every district named, but it does show how far Norse power still extended, and how deeply it had become woven into the politics of the Irish Sea. Magnus Barefoot later renewed that force dramatically. His campaigns in the late 11th century brought him to the western coasts and islands, and tradition remembers him compelling the people of Galloway to supply timber and labour for the building of fortifications. Whether those strongholds stood in Galloway itself or in nearby island possessions, the episode again proves the same thing. The district was under Northern command strongly enough that its inhabitants could be forced into royal service. This phase belongs to the final height of Norse control in the southwest. By then, Scottish kings were still not firmly established there. Whatever authority they claimed, it did not amount to effective possession, while Norse rulers still held the sea and the coast. Only after the death of Magnus and the weakening of Scandinavian political strength did the kings of Scotland begin to secure a more lasting hold over the region. Even then, the change was not immediate. The older Norse presence had sunk deeply into the land. One of the clearest signs of that presence survives in the names of places. Borland is one of the most revealing. The meaning has often been misunderstood, but comparison with Orkney and other Norse territories shows what it really was. In the northern islands, the Bordlands were lands reserved for the use of the earls, places that formed part of their own estate and were exempt from ordinary land tax. These were not peasant holdings, but privileged lands linked directly to lordship and government. The same term appears repeatedly in Galloway. That is no accident. It points to a similar system, one in which Norse rulers held and administered the land in ways familiar across their wider realm. The number of Borlands in Galloway is especially striking. Their concentration there is too great to dismiss as coincidence. Similar names appear in Orkney and elsewhere in clearly Norse districts, and old rentals from the islands explicitly preserve the meaning, stating that such lands paid no ordinary tax because they were Bordland. Copyists later distorted the spelling, but the underlying term remains visible. In Galloway, the old form Bordland appears in early records as well, and the meaning fits perfectly. These were lands connected with ruling power, not with any imagined Saxon village economy. Another place name long misunderstood is Ingleston or Engleston. Some try to derive it from English settlement, while others connected it with the Scottish word for a fireside or hearth. Neither explanation is convincing in the Galloway context. The better origin lies in the Norse word for meadow or grassland. That meaning suits the land itself far more naturally, and it also fits the way Scandinavian naming works elsewhere. The fact that families bearing the surname Inglis are never found styled from these places weakens the old theory even more. The name belongs to the land, not to some supposed English family. The same must be said of Carlton in the district. It too was once dragged into theories of Anglo-Saxon occupation, but that cannot stand. The name is not truly English in origin there. It is a corruption of an Irish personal name combined with a Norse ending meaning farm or settlement. That ending itself, found in so many place names, was carried into the district through Scandinavian influence. The result is not an Anglo-Saxon landscape, but a mixed one, shaped by Irish and Norse elements together. More examples strengthen the same conclusion. The common ending by in names of places marks Scandinavian settlement in many parts of Britain, especially where Norse colonization was strongest. Such names appear in Galloway and neighbouring districts just as they do in recognised Norse areas of England, Man and the Isles. The same pattern applies to words for valley, hill, marsh, farm, holm and rocky coast. Many names in Galloway that later generations treated as simply local or native can be explained far more clearly through Norse. The evidence is cumulative. No single name proves everything, but together they reveal a district deeply marked by Scandinavian occupation. Words such as fell for hill, flow for marshy moor, and holm for riverside ground or islet all belong to this layer. So do names built from garth, fleet, and several others. They are not scattered accidents. They form a language of settlement. In each case, the words suit the landscape and connect Galloway to a much wider northern world extending through the Isles, Caithness, Orkney, Shetland, Cumberland, and the Scandinavian homelands themselves. This linguistic evidence matters because it cuts through old assumptions. For too long, some writers tried to see Galloway as either Anglo-Saxon in character or purely Celtic in continuity. The place names show something different. The district was profoundly reshaped by Norse rule and then by the mixing of Norse and Gaelic populations. Even the very name Galloway seems to reflect this mixed condition, carrying the sense of foreign Gaels, a population in which Norse and Celtic elements had become joined. That meaning suits the history exactly. The wider Scandinavian occupation of the Western Seas makes the same story even more credible. The Norse held not only islands but mainland districts. They established themselves in Ireland so firmly that they founded towns, issued coinage, and became part of the island's political structure. They were not driven out in any total sense. They remained, changed, and blended. The same happened in Scotland. The western coast, the Isles, and parts of the mainland all entered the Norse orbit. Galloway, sitting between Cumberland, Man, Ireland, and the western seaways, was too central to escape that transformation. The climate of the far north even helps explain a habit mentioned in the sagas: the tendency of Norse jarls to winter in the north while ruling farther south in summer. The islands and northern coasts, warmed by the Atlantic currents, could offer milder winter conditions than many inland regions farther south. That may help explain why rulers who controlled territories stretching deep into Scotland still returned seasonally to Caithness, Orkney, or Shetland. Their realm was maritime, and their movement followed the sea. By the beginning of the 12th century, the political balance was shifting. Malcolm Canmore and his successors gradually extended Scottish royal influence southward and westward, but this did not mean that Galloway had long been theirs. It meant the opposite. Their authority only became real after Norse power weakened. David, first as prince and later as king, appears as one of the earliest Scottish rulers whose grip on Galloway can be clearly traced. Even then, he was taking over a region whose previous rulers had been sea lords, not native kings, in an unbroken local line. This leads directly to the question of the later Lords of Galloway. Their story was often misunderstood because writers wanted to create an ancient native succession, where none can be clearly shown. The district had belonged first to Strathclyde, then to Norse rulers, and only later to the expanding Kingdom of Scotland. In that context, the first known lordly figures in Galloway appear not as descendants of some continuous local kingship, but as men rising under new political conditions. The old attempts to derive them directly from much earlier chiefs are weak and often collapse under scrutiny. Figures such as Ulgric and Dovanold, named among the leaders of the Galwegians at the Battle of the Standard, were long treated as if they stood at the head of a native dynastic line reaching into remote antiquity. But the evidence does not support that. Ulgric is a northern name and appears more naturally in a Scandinavian setting. Dovanold belonged to a family east of the Nith, not to a royal house of western or southern Galloway. Once those confusions are cleared away, the path is open to a more realistic understanding of the first true lords of Galloway. The first of these was Fergus. Beyond the bare outline of his life, little can be known with certainty about his ancestry. He appears in charters of the Scottish court and was clearly a man of high standing under David. He was no shadowy tribal king from an ancient line, lost in legend. He was a powerful court-connected noble whose position belonged to the 12th century. It is possible that some Norse blood ran in his family. It is also possible that his rise owed something to men who had once served as deputies or local magnates under the Norse earls. But this remains speculation. What is clear is that by Fergus's time the old Norse age in Galloway was ending, and a new lordship was forming under the growing authority of the Scottish crown. That transition did not pass without struggle. Tradition remembers a final conflict after the death of David, when the Northmen attempted to recover their supremacy in Galloway. According to local memory, they were defeated by the inhabitants on a moor in the interior. Whether every detail of the story is exact matters less than its meaning. It preserves the memory of a last attempt by the old sea power to reclaim a district it had once ruled, and of a local population now strong enough to resist it. By then, Galloway had already been transformed more than once. British, Irish Scot, and Norse layers had all settled into the land. Out of that mixture, the later medieval lordship emerged. The idea that Fergus inherited authority in Galloway as a direct descendant of Dovenold, the son of Donegal, does not stand up to close examination. No reliable evidence connects Fergus to that family line, and nothing proves that he rose to power through a long native tradition of hereditary rulers. The historical pattern of the region suggests something very different. Galloway had passed through several phases of control, first under the Kingdom of Strathclyde, later under Norse rule, and finally under the expanding authority of the Scottish crown. In that context, Fergus appears not as the heir of an ancient local dynasty, but as a figure appointed to govern a difficult frontier territory. It is therefore unlikely that Fergus exercised absolute princely authority over Galloway in the sense that later writers imagined. His position was far closer to that of a governor acting under royal authority. Comparable arrangements already existed elsewhere. In Cumberland, which at that time was connected with the Scottish kingdom, the region had been entrusted to the Mesquines family. In northern Scotland, earlier, rulers had also relied on powerful provincial officials known as mormayers to manage distant territories. Those officials sometimes exercised wide influence when kings were weak. Fergus, however, served under a very different monarch. David I was a strong and determined ruler whose power rested on a network of loyal supporters, many of them foreigners who had risen under his patronage. The circumstances surrounding Fergus's rise strongly suggest that he was placed in authority shortly after the famous Battle of the Standard in 1138. That conflict took place near Northallerton in northern England and involved a large army assembled by the Scottish king. Forces from many regions took part, including levies from Scotland, Cumberland, and Galloway. Contemporary descriptions place the total strength of the army at roughly 26,000 men. Among these troops, the Galwegians were known for their ferocity in battle and insisted on leading the vanguard, claiming it as their traditional right. The exact reason for this privilege remains unclear, yet their reputation as fierce fighters may explain it. At the beginning of the battle, their courage was undeniable. They advanced with great determination, but they were soon exposed to the disciplined volleys of English archers. The arrows inflicted devastating losses. The Galwegian warriors suffered heavy casualties, and once their front ranks collapsed, the entire formation began to break apart. What had begun as a fierce assault turned into a disorderly retreat. The defeat was severe, and many of their most experienced fighters were lost on the field. The consequences of that disaster created an opportunity for King David to impose tighter control over the region. The people of Galloway had long been known for their turbulent independence and resistance to outside authority. After the battle, their strength had been weakened and their morale shaken. For a determined ruler, this was the ideal moment to introduce a loyal administrator who could restrain the population and maintain order. Fergus seems to have been placed in charge under precisely these circumstances. During the 17 years when David had ruled as Prince of Cumbria before becoming king, he had already cultivated strong alliances with the Norman families settled along the English border. These connections provided him with a reliable circle of supporters who shared his political ambitions and religious outlook. Contemporary writers even describe David as feared above all by the men of Galloway, suggesting that the region posed a particular challenge to his authority. After the defeat at the Battle of the Standard, he possessed both the motive and the means to secure control of the district more firmly. Fergus's conduct after gaining power also suggests that he was not a traditional local chieftain. Instead of relying on established customs, he immediately began supporting the expansion of the institutional church, favoured by the king. Churches and religious houses associated with the English church tradition began to appear in the region. This development marked a sharp contrast with the older religious traditions connected with the monastic community, founded by Columba on the island of Iona. The older Celtic Christian network had long been influential in the western parts of Scotland, but it stood apart from the authority of Rome. David was determined to bring his kingdom into closer alignment with the Roman Church, and Fergus appears to have supported that policy enthusiastically. This religious transformation was part of a wider strategy pursued by the Scottish king. David had spent much of his earlier life in England and had absorbed many of the political and ecclesiastical ideas circulating there. When he gained power in Scotland, he encouraged the spread of institutions modelled on those he had observed abroad. Norman knights and administrators were welcomed into the kingdom and rewarded with land and influence. Monasteries were founded across the country, often staffed by monks invited from England or the continent. These religious houses served both spiritual and political purposes. They reinforced royal authority while helping to reshape the cultural landscape. Fergus's marriage further illustrates his connection with this broader political world. He married Elizabeth, an illegitimate daughter of King Henry I of England. Henry had ruled England from 1100 until 1135. Such a marriage strongly suggests that Fergus had spent time in England before his rise in Galloway. Without close contact at court, it would have been difficult for such a union to take place. The timing of the marriage also indicates that Fergus's family life began well before he assumed authority in Galloway, since several generations of descendants followed. Additional evidence supports the idea that Fergus was already associated with the circle around King David before receiving his position in the southwest. One episode preserved in tradition describes how Fergus founded the Priory of St Mary on a small island near Kirkcudbright as an act of reconciliation with the king. At an earlier time, Fergus had apparently been involved, directly or indirectly, in a rebellion led by Angus, Earl of Moray, while David was absent from Scotland. When the revolt was crushed, Fergus risked severe punishment. According to the story, the abbot Alwyn intervened and disguised Fergus as a monk during a ceremony at Holyrood. When the king greeted him with the ritual kiss of peace, he discovered the deception but chose to pardon him. Fergus's later generosity toward the church was remembered as an expression of gratitude for this act of mercy. The Priory of St Mary became the first religious foundation established by Fergus in Galloway after he assumed authority. It was linked closely to the monastery of Holyrood in Edinburgh, whose monks received lands nearby as part of the endowment. From that moment, Fergus devoted considerable energy to supporting church institutions. New religious houses appeared in several parts of the region, including foundations at Withorn, Tungland, and Salseat. These establishments were generously supplied with land and resources. An important feature of these foundations was the origin of their clergy. Instead of drawing monks from local traditions, Fergus and his successors brought religious communities from England and continental Europe. This choice reinforced the new ecclesiastical orientation, favoured by the Scottish crown. The influence of monasteries connected with Iona gradually diminished as the Roman Church expanded its presence. The process was part of a larger transformation that reshaped religious life across Scotland during the 12th century. Fergus's name itself offers no reliable clue to his ethnic background. The name was used in several cultures around the North Sea and Irish Sea worlds. It appears among Norse communities as well as among Celtic populations. Because of this overlap, it cannot be used as proof of nationality. What matters more is the network of relationships surrounding him. His marriage alliances, his association with the royal court, and his religious policies all place him within the political culture encouraged by King David. For many years, Fergus governed Galloway without major upheaval. The situation changed after the death of David in 1153. His successor, Malcolm, was still young, and the political balance of the kingdom shifted. During this period, Fergus joined forces with Somerled, the powerful ruler of Argyll, in a rebellion against royal authority. Their combined forces attacked the western coast and sought wider support. Some hoped to place a rival claimant on the Scottish throne with assistance from Norse allies. The alliance between Fergus and Somerled is particularly revealing. Somerled's background has long been debated, yet his connections with Norse families and maritime power are unmistakable. His mother was of Scandinavian descent, and he married a daughter of the Norse king who ruled the Isles. Through these links, Somerled stood at the crossroads of Gaelic and Norse traditions. His partnership with Fergus suggests that the political networks of the Western Seaways still played an important role in the region. The rebellion ultimately failed. Somerled was killed during a campaign near Renfrew, and Fergus lost his position soon afterward. Whether he resigned voluntarily or was stripped of authority is uncertain. But by 1160 he'd withdrawn from power. He retired to Holyrood Abbey and took religious vows as a canon. The following year he died there, bringing his turbulent career to an end. His association with Holyrood framed both the beginning and the close of his public life. The same monastery, whose abbot had once interceded on his behalf, provided refuge in his final days. Later, chroniclers referred to Fergus as a Prince of Galloway, but this title seems to have originated among the monks who benefited from his generosity. In formal charters, the designation does not appear. It was more likely an honorific expression of respect rather than an official title. The legacy of Fergus continued through his children. He left two sons, Uchtred and Gilbert, and a daughter named Africa. Through her marriage to Olav, the Norse ruler of Man and the Isles, another link was forged between Galloway and the Scandinavian world of the Western Seas. This connection further illustrates how closely the politics of the region were intertwined with events beyond the Scottish mainland. Uchtred succeeded his father in authority over Galloway. His position, like that of Fergus, depended heavily on the support of the Church and the Scottish Crown. He strengthened this relationship by granting numerous churches and lands to religious institutions. Several parishes that had once belonged to the older monastic tradition connected with Iona were transferred to houses aligned with the Roman Church. These gifts secured the goodwill of powerful ecclesiastical allies and reinforced the political structure introduced under David. The transformation of religious life in Galloway reflected broader developments throughout the kingdom. The English Church, already connected with Rome, had long cultivated strong ties with the aristocracy and the royal court. In England, bishops and abbots were frequently drawn from influential families and often participated in civil administration. When this model spread northward, it carried similar patterns into Scotland. Monasteries became centres not only of devotion but also of landholding, education, and political influence. In this environment, Uchtred's reputation as a pious patron of the church served practical as well as spiritual purposes. He founded new religious houses, including a Benedictine establishment at Clwyd, and endowed them with extensive lands. Other monasteries received large estates in the region. Through these gifts, Uchtred secured powerful allies who helped sustain his authority. Despite these efforts, tensions within Galloway remained strong. Rivalries among local leaders, combined with resentment toward outside control, created a volatile atmosphere. The conflict eventually erupted in a tragic episode. In 1174, Uchtred was murdered in a brutal manner by his own brother, Gilbert, during a dispute over power. The killing shocked contemporaries and plunged the region into further turmoil. Gilbert seized control of Galloway after the murder and sought protection from the English king rather than from the Scottish crown. His actions revealed once again how closely the politics of the region were tied to the broader struggle for influence between neighbouring kingdoms. Although his initial appeal was rejected, he later secured peace by paying a heavy fine and offering his son as a hostage. During these years, warfare and internal conflict continued to disturb the region. Battles were fought between rival factions, and various leaders attempted to claim authority. Eventually, the balance shifted again when Uchtred's son, Roland, regained control with the approval of the Scottish king. His rise marked another stage in the long and complex struggle over the leadership of Galloway. The history of the district during this period reveals a landscape shaped by shifting alliances, religious change, and the lingering influence of Norse power. Authority did not pass smoothly from one generation to another. Instead, it emerged from conflict, negotiation, and the intervention of kings and churches. The story of Fergus and his successors belongs to this turbulent era when Galloway stood at the meeting point of several political worlds.